everyone. It's 10 a.m., so we're going to go ahead and get started. Welcome to the inaugural meeting of the Hospital Robocall Protection Group, or the group, which we will now call to order. Thank you for being here today. My name is Donna Cyrus, the designated federal officer of this advisory committee. My colleague, Elisa Katz, is the deputy designated federal officer. Greg Cook is the chief of the Office of Intergovernmental Affairs of the Consumer and Governmental Affairs Bureau. At this time, I would like to introduce the chair of the group, Dave Summit, Chief Information Security Officer at the Moffitt Cancer Center. Good morning, Dave, and welcome.
Hi, good morning, Donna, and thank you very much. And I want to acknowledge Chairman Pai. Thank you very much for this opportunity, and to the commissioners, the HRPG members, and commission staff. Actually, a shout out to the team members that have helped get this virtual meeting together. It's been challenging, and they've done a fantastic job. I'm privileged and honored to have been selected as the chairman to lead the Hospital Robocall Protection Group and its very important mission. As the Chief Information Security Officer for Moffitt Cancer Center, I'm all too familiar with the negative impact robocalls have had on healthcare organizations and their ability to effectively operate and provide care to patients. Having a history of leading the charge against unlawful robocalls, including providing testimony to Congress on the harmful effects on hospitals, I look forward to working with the HRPG to continue the fight against these unlawful practices. And again, thank you very much, and I look forward to working with each and every one of you.
Thank you, Dave. Now I'd like to introduce the group vice chair, Patrick Halley of U.S. Telecom.
Thank you very much. It is a pleasure to be joining all of you. I want to echo the thanks to the FCC staff, those who are responsible for this particular effort in organizing this meeting, but more broadly as well from the folks in the Enforcement Bureau, the Consumer Governmental Affairs Bureau, and the Wireline Competition Bureau. It truly is an all-agency effort, and from the industry's perspective, it's one that we greatly appreciate. So I'm pleased to be here with all of you to launch the Hospital Robocall Protection Group today. I want to thank Chairman Pai, his fellow commissioners, and all the staff, and for selecting me as vice chair. As we all know, unwanted and illegal robocalls are more than a mere nuisance. They can also scam innocent victims out of their life savings. Sophisticated criminal actors can also use our telephone network to target critical institutions like 911 centers and other community anchor institutions like hospitals, which brings us here today. There's certainly no single solution to solving this problem. It takes an ongoing coordinated effort between government and industry. We've certainly seen firsthand through our efforts running the Industry Traceback Group, working directly with the Federal Communications Commission, the Federal Trade Commission, other federal agencies, state attorney general's offices, that these efforts working together truly can make a difference in tackling this problem. So very much looking forward to working with all of you on this critical issue as part of this working group. Thank you.
Thank you, Patrick. We look forward to working with you as well. And now it is my pleasure to introduce the chairman of the FCC, Chairman Ajit Pai. Welcome, Mr. Chairman, and thank you for joining us this morning.
Well, thank you so much for giving me a chance to speak, and hope everybody is doing well and staying safe. And I just wanted to extend my welcome to this inaugural meeting of the Hospital Robocall Protection Group. This is, of course, as everybody knows, the federal advisory committee that Congress has tasked with recommending best practices to help voice service providers and hospitals and federal and state governments combat illegal robocalls to hospitals. And I just want to thank the members of the group who I know are going to be dedicating their valuable and scarce time for developing the best practices required by Congress in the TRACE Act. I want to offer particular thanks to Dave Summit, the Chief Information Security Officer of the Moffitt Cancer Center, for agreeing to serve as our chair, and as well Patrick Halley, the Senior Vice President at U.S. Telecom, as well as an FCC alum, I might add, for agreeing to serve as vice chair. And I also want to recognize and thank my colleagues and friends, FCC Commissioner Brendan Carr and FTC Commissioner Noah Phillips, who will be representing these respective agencies on the group. Now, this is, of course, a virtual meeting, which has become the new normal for agency activities of this kind. as we seek to mitigate the risks of exposure due to the coronavirus pandemic. And that we're able to do so is a testament to technology, which is connecting us in ways that were unthinkable not that long ago. But of course, technology also enables not so savory connections, including those which inspire our meeting today, unlawful robocalls. These robocalls pose significant risks to and impose significant costs on medical professionals and facilities that rely on robust, ready, and resilient voice services to do their job and to help address health crises in their communities every single day. But every moment that hospital staff have to spend defending themselves from unsolicited spam calls, from scammers using false caller IDs, from spoofing calls to hospital employees seeking confidential information, or from any other type of improper robocalls, all of that diverts precious resources from the management of the health and well-being of the American people. This is no mere nuisance, even in the best of times under normal conditions, and it's simply intolerable in the midst of a pandemic and some of the associated healthcare challenges that go along with that. Now, through the TRACE Act, as everybody knows, Congress has charged the FCC with establishing this advisory committee to tackle this scourge by issuing best practices. And Congress asked us to tackle three specific questions. Number one, how voice service providers and other entities can better combat unlawful robocalls made to hospitals. Number two, how hospitals can better protect themselves from such calls, including by using unlawful robocall mitigation techniques. And number three, how the federal government and state governments can help combat such calls. Now, Congress has asked for action on this task within 180 days, about 6 months. And so I would ask the group to issue best practices covering these three topics within that time frame. And I know that's a tight time frame, but I'm confident that this distinguished group is up to the task. The members of the group have been carefully chosen to represent the 6 categories specified by Congress. For example, voice service providers, including one-way VoIP providers, who've dedicated themselves to combating robocalls for their consumers and their business customers. As well, hospital administrators and officials who know all too well firsthand what the risks and effects are of these calls. Additionally, consumer advocates who specialize in the communications needs of the vulnerable. Robocall risk mitigation professionals, who are, of course, public officials who specialize in public health and safety compliance and enforcement, and our dedicated public servants here at the FCC and FTC, Commissioner Carr and Phillips. So in short, I think we have the right people for the job, and we are tackling this issue at the right time. And so I just want to commend and thank all of you for lending your time and your talent and your efforts to this important challenge. American patients and their families and loved ones want and need their healthcare professionals to be unburdened by the distraction of unlawful robocalls. It's more important than ever that robocalls don't stand in the way of these professionals extending care to those who need it. And so your work here is a critical step towards getting that done. And I'm really grateful to you for taking a laboring oar on these issues. So thanks so much again for letting me speak, and look forward to hearing the results of the deliberations today and in the time to come.
Thank you so much, Mr. Chairman. This is a great group, and we're all looking forward to the work product and to the process, which I am sure will be a lot of work, but enjoyable as well. I would now like to introduce Patrick Weber, Chief of the FCC's Consumer and Governmental Affairs Bureau.
Good morning, everyone. Thank you, Donna, and good morning to everyone, and welcome to the inaugural meeting of our Hospital Robocall Protection Group. And as I was just listening to the introductions, I know we have 2 Patricks on the call, Patrick Halley and me as well. So it's good to have another Patrick on the call. Our names are not that common. So welcome to the Robocall Protection Group, Patrick. And I just wanted to mention that, we're happy that the Consumer Governmental Affairs Bureau, the bureau that I'm bureau chief of, is very happy and thankful to have this opportunity to launch a federal advisory committee tasked with this very important proceeding and developing best practices that hospitals can use to protect themselves and their patients from unlawful robocalls. It's hard to imagine an environment in which robocalls can do more harm than in hospitals. Efficient and accurate communication is not just a convenience in hospitals, it's essential if they're to perform their life-saving functions. And the team from CGB has assembled a full agenda today to help you get started on your important mission as directed by the TRACE Act. So from our agenda, you can see that we'll first be briefing you on the structure of the HRPG and the rules under which it must operate. And then later we'll be offering you presentations from some FCC subject matter experts on the Commission's ongoing initiatives to combat unwanted and illegal robocalls. And we'll start also this afternoon with a presentation by HRPG Chair Dave Summit on his experiences with robocalls in the hospital setting. As folks know, CGB is the Commission's primary link to the American consumer. So as such, we're on the front lines to help protect consumers from nuisances like robocalls that impede the rapid and efficient communication systems that the Communications Act charges us with furthering. Our actions include leading various rulemaking proceedings, you'll hear about some of those today, and conducting consumer education and outreach. It's very important for us to inform consumers about these scams and what they can do to protect themselves. We also house the Commission's Consumer Complaint Center, where we hear firsthand about how robocalls affect our fellow Americans. So all of the actions that we take on a daily basis, including the establishment of the HRPG with today's meeting, are part of the FCC's overall multi-pronged approach to combating unwanted and illegal robocalls. So focusing specifically on the work of this group, I want to first thank each of you, each of our members, for their commitment. Your time and your talents are very important to this goal. And thanks especially to HRPG Chair Dave Summit and Vice Chair Patrick Haley. I'd also like to thank FCC Commissioner Brendan Carr and FTC Commissioner Noah Phillips for their time and talents for serving on the HRPG as well. We look forward to working with all of you on the important tasks assigned to the HRPG under the TRACE Act. And as you know, you'll need to move fast. Pursuant to the TRACE Act, your recommendations are due by the end of the year. I know you're up to the task, as the chairman mentioned earlier, and I know the team that we've assembled from CGB is up to the task as well. And speaking of our CGB team, I'd like to introduce just a few of the CGB staff who will be devoted to this effort. First is CGB Deputy Bureau Chief Barbara Espin, who manages the CGB division that is administering the HRPG, and that's CGB's Office of Intergovernmental Affairs, or IGA. Greg Cook is the chief of that division, and he's been instrumental in getting things off the ground for us. We also have Donna Cyrus, who everyone's heard from this morning already, our designated federal officer, and our deputy designated federal officer is Eliza Katz. Both of them are in IGA, and I want to thank them and all of the hardworking folks in IGA for getting us off the ground and getting us sort of rolling on this very quick turnaround that we have to perform under. And all of us look forward to the successful completion of this important work that you're about to undertake. We look forward to receiving your recommendations on best practices to address the unique problems of robocalls affecting hospitals. And thank you again in advance for your hard work and efforts on this important mission. Thanks again.
Thank you very much, Patrick. All right, so we are going to take a little bit more time to introduce the members. Speak for at least 5 minutes or so. This is your opportunity to get to know one another. We have some very distinguished members in the group. I am going to call out the names in alphabetical order. And so take this time to, tell us about yourself. We also as you have heard, we also have the honor of 2 commissioners in the group. I will call them last to speak. All right, let's get started with John Brayo. John, please tell us who you work for and a little bit about your work.
Hi, this is John. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
Great. So thank you for the introduction and for inviting me to participate in this working group. I'm the Vice President of Public Policy, Telecommunications, and Fraud at the National Consumers League. NCL is America's oldest consumer advocacy organization. We were founded in 1899. I handle, among other things, our fraud.org campaign, which is a campaign we launched in the 1990s to help educate and empower consumers to spot and avoid frauds and scams of all kinds. And so we run a website at fraud.org where we take in approximately 6,000 to 7,000 consumer complaints a year. that we share with a network of law enforcement and consumer protection agencies, including the Federal Trade Commission. Robocalls has been a constant source of consumer complaints that we hear about at fraud.org, as it is with the FTC and the FCC. And so we can think of no more disruptive robocalls than ones that affect consumers' healthcare. So I'm really pleased to be part of the working group. I look forward to providing our organization's perspective and consumers' perspective generally to the work that this group is going to be doing on this really important issue. Thank you.
All right. Thank you so much, John. Next, we have Mark Collier. Mark, tell us about yourself, where you work, the kind of work you do, and the contributions that you can make to this group.
Hi, great. Can you hear me okay?
Yes.
Hi, so thank you. And again, I'm very appreciative of being on this panel. So again, my name is Mark Collier. I'm the CTO at SecureLogix. And what SecureLogix does is, the easiest way to think of our technology is we provide a call firewall that sits at the edge of an enterprise or hospital network and monitors the traffic for various types of voice attacks, including robocalls and spoofing and other issues that would affect the administrative portions of a hospital or hospital system, and also the patient rooms and the phones there. So that's the simplest way to think of what we do. So we provide that technology primarily through our service provider partners, such as Verizon or AT&T, to try to deal with that issue in, again, hospitals and other types of enterprises.
Okay.
And that's it. Thank you.
All right. Next up is Joseph Cunningham. Joseph, we're looking forward to hearing about the type of work that you do and the contributions that you expect to make to the group.
Good morning. It's John Cunningham. Good morning,
My
everyone.
apologies.
No worries. No worries. I would like to thank Chairman Pai and the FCC for this opportunity. It's certainly a privilege and an honor to participate with such a distinguished group of leaders and to assist the Hospital Robocall Protection Group in fulfilling its very important mission. I'm the Director of Fraud Management Operations and Security for CenturyLink, responsible for the prevention, investigation, and mitigation of fraud schemes perpetrated against CenturyLink and its customers. I've spent over 30 years fighting various types of telecom fraud, which certainly includes illegal robocalling, caller ID spoofing schemes and scams, and the mitigation and defense strategies. I have had the privilege of working with some of you on this very group within the industry robocall committees, including the U.S. Telecom Traceback Mitigation and Enforcement Committee, as well as the 2016 FCC Cross Industry Strike Force Detection, Assessment, Traceback, and Mitigation Working Group. These initiatives, including the great work by the FCC Enforcement Bureau and the FTC, I think we've made all great strides in fighting illegal robocalls, and I'm excited to get started in addressing the issues before the HRPG. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Next, we have Aaron Foss. Aaron, please tell us about your work and your expected contributions to the group. We look forward to working with you.
Hi there, can you hear me okay?
Yes, we can.
Sounds great. Thank you for the introduction. Thank you, Chairman Pai. My name is Aaron Foss. I'm the founder of NomoRobo. I won the FTC's Robocall Challenge back in 2013, which seems like an eternity ago in the robocall stopping world. At NomoRobo, we've stopped almost 2 billion robocalls from reaching American consumers, and I always look at that as a drop in the bucket. I think that we can do a ton more just to protect everybody, and especially the hospitals, right? Both on the incoming robocalls that can disrupt all of the operations, as well as making sure that the good robocalls, doctors and pharmacies, and now with COVID test results and things like that, also get through. So I think it's we have to look at it from both points. Both sides of the equation, and yeah, this group that's been assembled has been absolutely fantastic, and I'm looking forward to really making an impact here. So thank you.
Wonderful. We're looking forward to having you. Next up is Gunnar Halley. Please tell us about yourself.
Hi, I'm Gunnar Halley. I am an assistant general counsel at Microsoft Corporation. We have several different calling platforms, including Skype, which is one of the larger one-way VoIP services. I'm also a representative for the Voice on the Net Coalition to the Secure Telephone Identity Governance Authority, working on stir, shake, and call authentication. And I support Microsoft's internal engineers who provide technical contributions both to that board as well as to other robocall mitigation efforts. I also support the engineering teams as they develop these products for launch across the world, and hope to be able to bring some both technical and international perspective in helping to combat illegal robocalls to hospitals. Thank you. We're honored and pleased to be involved with this.
Thank you so much. We're also honored to have you. Next up is our Vice Chair, Patrick Halley, who you've already heard a little bit from, but now he's going to expand on it a little bit and tell us more about his work.
Thanks, Donna. I'm also glad that not only do we have two Patricks, we have two Halleys. Now that is rare. So you guys have done some really good selecting.
Yes.
So I'm Senior Vice President at U.S. Telecom. U.S. Telecom represents broadband innovators of all different sizes and shapes, from the largest companies, some of the largest companies in the world, like AT&T and Verizon and CenturyLink, to smaller companies focused on rural markets. And in addition to our broadband and telephone providers, we also have others that serve that space on the infrastructure side as well. We have been very focused on the issue of illegal robocalls for years now. Most importantly, I would say, is our work leading the industry traceback group, which, if you're not familiar with it, is a group that consists of companies from across the telephone calling ecosystem, from wireless and wireline companies who have retail end user subscribers who are the victims of all of these robocalls that we're desperately trying to stop, including cable companies as well, and voice companies, to also wholesale companies that are in the middle of the call path, up to voice over IP companies that are sometimes the originators of these calls. And the purpose of that group is simple. It is to work together collaboratively and collectively to identify the source of the illegal calls, often originating overseas, but certainly not always. And as part of that effort, we work very closely with federal and state enforcement agencies to ensure that those who are the source of these illegal calls stop making them. So that is our primary contribution, I would say. At the same time, we're obviously very focused on other issues as well, around stir, shake, and implementation, and call labeling and call blocking solutions to make sure that consumers are able to not get the calls that they don't want, but also to ensure that those who have legitimate reason to be making robocalls are able to complete their legal calls. So we're very happy to be here. This is an important effort, and look forward to working with everybody.
All right. Thank you so much. Look forward to working with you as well. Joseph Delato just called my attention to the fact that I skipped over him in alphabetical order, so we're going to double back and hear from Joseph. Go ahead, Joseph, and tell us about yourself.
Thank you. My name is Joseph Delato, and I'm the Vice President of Voice and Unified Communications Product at Spectrum Enterprise, which is the business unit of Charter Communications that provides network and managed services to large enterprises. In that capacity, I'm responsible for our product roadmap and end-to-end customer experience. Just by way of background, I'm a 30-year telecommunications veteran, and for the past 15 years, I've been leading various business services product initiatives at a number of different service providers. I've been working with our network teams to implement shake and stirred authentication and advanced call analytics into our network, and with our operations groups in incorporating anti-robocalling principles into our business practices. I look forward to working with the team to contribute the perspective and experience of a voice service provider. Thank you.
Thank you so much. All right. Next is Dawit Kasai. Please go ahead and tell us about your work.
Hi, this is David Kasai. I hope you can hear me. I am the Senior Legislative Representative at ARP, Government Affairs, on the Federal Financial Security and Consumer Affairs team. I manage ARP's federal telecom issues. It is a pleasure to join all of you and for inviting me to participate in this working group. ARP is the nation's largest nonprofit, nonpartisan organization dedicated to empowering people 50 and older to choose how they live as they age. With a nationwide presence and nearly 38 million members, ARP strengthens communities and advocates for what matters most to families: health security, financial stability, and personal fulfillment. ARP has a long history of fighting for protections for older Americans and has been on the forefront of advocacy in support of federal and state laws and regulations that prevent financial exploitation and scams targeting seniors. I look forward to providing our organization's perspective, and again, thank you for having me part of this group.
Thank you so much. We look forward to having you as well. All right, next up is Creasy Johnson. Go ahead, Creasy. We'd love to hear from you.
Hi, Donna. Thank you. This is Creasy Johnson, and I am an attorney in the Consumer Protection Division of the North Carolina Attorney General's Office. I have been there about 15 years. And about 2 years ago, North Carolina, along with Indiana and New Hampshire, decided to form a multi-state group of state AG's offices to focus specifically on the issue of robocalls. State AGs have been working together along with our federal partners on do not call and telemarketing issues for many years, but with the proliferation of robocalls, we wanted to form a group specifically to tackle this issue. And I'll mention that both Michigan and Arkansas, who are represented here on this committee, are part of our state AG's robocall executive committee as well. And our group, to begin with, worked with a number of telecom companies to learn about how the telecom industry is fighting robocalls. We came out with a set of anti-robocall principles about a year ago, which is a set of best practices, if you will, for companies combating robocalls. And we're now working as a group to coordinate investigations and litigation against robocallers and other bad actors. I'm very, very much looking forward to being part of this group. Thanks so much.
Thank you very much. We're looking forward to it also. All right, next is Rebecca Johnson. Please tell us about yourself.
Thank you. I'm Rebecca Johnson, the founder and CEO of Numerical. I have been involved with combating robocalls since my time on the FCC's Robocall Strike Force. At that time, I was focused on healthcare communications with a focus on innovation of technologies to bring efficiencies around care coordination as a result of the recent regulatory requirements on hospitals. I was also a founding member of the High Trust Business Associate Council to establish privacy and security strategies between covered entities and their business associates for the care of patients. As a result of my time on the FCC's Robocall Strike Force, I established Numerical and have continued leading and innovating with a focus on protecting legal and wanted calls, while the rest of the industry, many in this group, focused heavily on combating the illegal and unwanted calls. With my extensive background in healthcare communications and the strategies for care, I will be contributing as a subject matter expert with a focus on the protection of the critical communications traversing the network to ensure we do not create unintended consequences against patients and practitioners as we build those barriers to fraudulent actors. And it is an honor and a privilege to serve, and I thank you for this opportunity.
You're very welcome. We look forward to having you. All right, next up is Dr. Irene Leach.
Good morning.
Good morning.
I am a faculty member at Virginia Tech. That's not why I'm on this group, but I teach consumer studies at Virginia Tech. I have also worked in the outreach portion of programming in cooperative extension. The real reason that I'm here is because of my involvement with the Consumer Federation of America and the consumer advocacy work that I've done as a volunteer through CFA and our Virginia consumer organization. And in addition, I bring the experience of someone who has lived for many years in a rural environment and the challenges particularly related to telecommunications there. And in fact, the fact that I am sitting in my campus office to do this instead of at home because I don't have sufficient internet service to be able to work from home in this time when almost nobody is on campus gives you some of that. And as I think about what we're challenged with here, with the robocalls and the hospitals and the patients who have not been able to have people with them as they may have in the past. A friend of mine spent 13 hours sitting in a parking deck, mostly, except she ran her car down because it was winter and had to call and get her car jumped to start again and then drive around for a while, but because she couldn't go in with her husband. And I think the things that we're dealing with now really give us some additional insight into what we need to consider relating to hospital patients and robocall. So looking forward to getting to know everyone and to working on this challenge.
Thank you so much. All right, we look forward to working with you as well. Next, we'll hear from Richard Lovage. Richard, please tell us about yourself.
Thank you, Donna. You can hear me okay?
Yes, I can.
Okay, great. Good morning, and thank you so much for hosting this, doing such a fantastic job. I'm honored and privileged to be part of this group. I am the managing partner at Stevenson, Acquisto, and Coleman, and for over 30 years, we have specialized in healthcare reimbursement litigation. I'm also the national legal counsel for AHAM, which is the American Association of Healthcare Administrative Management, which for over 50 years has been the premier national organization for revenue cycle professionals at hospitals. AHAM has been very, very active in TCPA clarification. I testified in 2016 before the Commerce Committee with regard to the impact of the lack of clarification of the TCPA and its impact on the healthcare industry. And just to make this very short, I echo Chairman Pai's comments with regard to any diversion of hospital resources to have to deal with robocalls, especially in this age of this pandemic, is criminal. And anything that we can do to stop that and anything we can do to help the industry combat that, I think is a noble cause. So thank you very much.
Thank you. I agree with you that it is a noble cause. All right. Next up, we have David McCoy. Please tell us about your work, David.
Hello, I'm David McCoy. I'm Assistant Attorney General in the the Consumer Protection Division of the Arkansas Attorney General's Office. I've been here about 6.5 years, and since that time, I've been assigned to focus on what we could do about robocalls. Attorney General Leslie Rutledge, our Attorney General, as she travels the state, this is the number one complaint, number one comments that she receives from consumers, legislators, law office holders all around our state. What can we do about robocalls? And as we discussed this in our office, we realized with our resources we couldn't solve the problem, but we wanted to figure out what we could do. And so we narrowed that down to consumer education, legislative acts, and investigative and enforcement actions. Consumer education, of course, is always ongoing. In 2019, we looked to strengthen our state laws and strengthen the Attorney General's enforcement powers, basically updating some of our laws regarding spoofing in particularly, because we felt spoofing was the gateway to robocalls. and we passed Act 677 of 2019 and Act 1074 of 2019, which raised made it a criminal penalty for illegal spoofing, and also required reporting from telecommunication providers about that they were certifying that they were utilizing the most available and applicable technologies to identify and block illegal spoof calls passing through their network. This was interesting enough. There are two acts that we had to pass because the first act was met with so much overwhelming approval from our legislator that it passed while we were still working out some of the language and terms with the providers. So about a week later, we had to amend that act to add that language. That's to say that this stopping robocalls, stopping these calls has overwhelming support of our consumers, our lawmakers at the state and federal levels. We have worked with the National Association of Attorney Generals working groups, the Robocall technology groups, Do Not Call working groups, the telecommunication working groups, to work with our state partners. We've also worked with U.S. Telecom's industry traceback group, and now we, along with like North Carolina and I think Michigan will say, are looking for more and more investigative and enforcement actions that our office can take. And I'm so happy to be involved in this group, and I hope I can contribute valuable. I hope I can make a valuable contribution. I'll leave it at that. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you, David. We're happy to have you as well. Next up is Wissam Naum.
Hello, thank you. Sorry, I had to get off mute. Thank you for the introduction, Donna. I'd like to thank the FCC chairman, the commissioners, and staff for selecting a representative from the state of Michigan. For my background, I'm an assistant attorney general within the corporate oversight division of the Michigan Department of Attorney General. Similar to Arkansas, North Carolina, and most states, robocalls are the #1 complaint our office receives, and our Attorney General, Dana Nessel, made this a priority item to deal with for her tenure. As such, not dissimilar from the other two states here, we launched Michigan's Robocall Crackdown Initiative in November of 2019, which includes partners such as the FCC, U.S. Telecom, the Better Business Bureau, AARP, Michigan Association for Local Public Health, and others. I am the architect behind our initiative, and it is focused on combating robocalls through collaboration with federal, state, industry, and consumer partners. Similar to Arkansas, we have a heavy focus on public education regarding the problem, how consumers can engage our office on the issue, including reporting robocalls that we may take action against, and learning how to best protect themselves from robocalls. We have an increased focus on enforcement. So, for instance, Michigan, alongside North Carolina, Arkansas, and a couple other states, filed a rather major lawsuit in June in the Southern District of Texas related to a rather large robocall operation out of Texas. And finally, we are working with our legislature to reform and update Michigan's laws on the subject, since they were last written, I believe, in the 70s. And as we all know, robocall technology has modernized. So as my colleague from North Carolina noted, Michigan sits on the executive committee for the Robocall Working Group of State Attorneys General, alongside North Carolina and Arkansas. And we are ecstatic to be part of this group and look forward to making some great recommendations.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. We look forward to working with you. Next up is John Riggy. Hi there, John. Can you tell us about yourself and your work?
Good morning, everybody. Can you hear me okay?
Yes, we can.
Great. John Riggy. I'm the Senior Advisor for Cybersecurity and Risk at the American Hospital Association. So at the AHA, we represent almost all the nation's hospitals, ranging everything from 10-bed frontier hospitals all the way up to multi-state, multi-thousand-bed systems. And when I recently did an informal poll of our members, mainly in their security and chief information officers, on this issue, when at first we were being solicited to see if we'd like to participate, we did get an incredible range of responses. Some had managed to mitigate the risk, but the majority of the respondents, everything from small hospitals all the way to the big systems, indicated still an ongoing major issue, and tying up vital communication lines, which are interfering with patient services and patient care. Also relevant, I think, for this group, part of my background is that I spent 28 years at the FBI, many years focused on international organized crime. And my last years, I was a senior executive in the cyber division, running their national outreach section. There to develop mission-critical partnerships with private sector, worked quite a bit with telecom, obviously on cyber issues, but also on many internet-enabled crimes, such as these type of spoofing calls and robocalls. And I can tell you the power of private sector combined with government really cannot be duplicated, and we really did adopt the phrase, instead of whole of government approach, whole of nation approach. And I see tremendous potential with this group, really in coming up with some viable solutions that will really help protect hospitals, protect communities, and continue to help protect public health and safety ultimately. So happy to be part of that group, and really look forward to being really part of this team. Thank you.
Thank you. We're looking forward to your contribution as well. Next, we have Chris Shipley. Hi there, Chris. Go ahead and tell us about yourself and your work.
Thank you, Donna, and thank you, Chairman Pai. It's an honor, really, to be working on this important issue alongside so many distinguished industry leaders. My name is Chris Shipley, and I'm an attorney and policy advisor for Encompass, a national industry association for providers of internet and competitive communications networks, including both wireline and wireless providers offering residential and enterprise services in the broadband, voice services, and video markets. Our members offer mass market services in urban, suburban, and rural areas, and provide business broadband services to schools, libraries, hospitals, and clinics, and businesses of all sizes. I manage the association's robocall and call authentication advocacy efforts, and work alongside our association's representative on the Secure Telephone Identity Governance Authority in the development and implementation of the STIR-SHAKEN framework. And I'm pleased to bring the experience and knowledge of our members, including our providers offering one-way VoIP service to the HRPG. And we had a number of members express an interest in contributing to the work of this group, given their own efforts to stop robocalls in their own areas. And Encompass is committed to mitigating unwanted calls to hospitals and healthcare providers. We're excited to be a part of this, appreciate the opportunity to be. Thank you. We're looking forward to the challenge.
Thank you so much. We're looking forward to working with you. Next is Dave Summit, who's the chair of the group. You've heard from him a little bit earlier, and now Dave is going to tell us a little bit more about his work.
Thank you, Donna, again, and again, appreciate the input of everyone on this advisory board. It is just an incredible opportunity for us to set some things in motion that can help combat this very bad issue. My name is Dave Summit. I'm the Chief Information Security Officer for Moffitt Cancer Center and Research Institute in Tampa, Florida. We have seen some very unique things happen over the last couple of years with this robocalling problem, which led up to the discussion in front of the committee. Just kind of giving our what has happened with us and the dangers that it has imposed. As we started gathering information there, we had polled several other organizations, healthcare across the country, about their experiences, and that quickly showed that we had just not an isolated incident here in our area, but just across the nation, and how negatively impacting it can be to healthcare operations and patient care. I've been at Moffitt for almost 6 years now, and it's a fantastic organization to work for. They have been incredibly supportive of the initiatives that we've tried to do there with cybersecurity and battling these types of issues. And I just look forward to hearing from everyone and getting this thing done and making some solid recommendations back to the FCC on what to do moving forward. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dave. All right, next up is Linda Vandeloop. Hi there, Linda. Please tell us about yourself and your work.
Hey, yes, thank you. So AT&T has a long history of trying to combat the illegal robocalls, including development of fraud investigation programs and stir-shaken standards to try and stop the spoofing. I have been involved in fact, in 2016 with the industry robocall strike force. Stopping robocalls have become the majority of my work responsibilities. Work internally and externally to identify, develop, and implement robocall mitigation tools, including working with the industry traceback process, the U.S. Telecom Industry Traceback, and the Secure Telephone Identity Governance Authority Board to implement STIR/SHAKEN. Our goal, and I believe the whole industry goal, is to stop all bad calls and deliver all calls that customers want to receive. And we found very early that we can't do that in isolation, and the whole ecosystem has really developed an amazing collaborative effort, including industry, law enforcement, consumer groups, and I think this is another opportunity for us to work together and expand our collaboration and develop some additional solutions and make a dent. So I really appreciate the opportunity to participate, and I really look forward to working with this group.
Thank you so much, Linda. We look forward to working with you as well. All right, so now we're going to ask Commissioner Brendan Carr of the FCC to give us some remarks.
Well, thank you all for having me on. Really appreciate it. I'm really impressed by the depth and range of experience we have on this call, and I'm really confident that we are going to make some significant progress on this issue. I mean, robocalls, to start with, from the hospital context or just to everyday Americans, is obviously the largest complaint we get at the FCC, and we have really prioritized our efforts from enforcement to rulemaking to make sure that everyone has the tools we need to address this issue. I mean, personally, I get them obviously whether I'm sitting on the dais at an FCC meeting or with my family, or look, when I'm walking down the street in DC, it's literally the one telecom issue where my neighbors will throw their window up and yell at me when I'm walking on the sidewalk and saying, what more can we do to help combat robocalls? And so the work that this group is going to do obviously touches on some of those broader issues, but there are also things that I think are unique about hospital settings, and it's important that we, focus on that and prioritize on that going forward. One, as we've heard, there is sort of the distraction that comes in a hospital setting from robocalls coming in during life-saving efforts that are underway. There's also sort of HIPAA, privacy, other issues that can be potential angles for breaches in scams being perpetrated. We see calls coming into nurses' stations that look like they're coming from within the hospital, where people are trying to fish for information potentially. There are potentially some unique steps we can take with respect to hospitals. Of course, I'm open to, us exploring a full range of them, but, for instance, with 911 call centers, we've been able to work with them to identify some ways that they can get expedited efforts in terms of addressing some of the robocalls directed at them
And so I think there may be some steps along those lines that we can take. But I'm very interested in sort of a soup to nuts approach of this group, of course, focused through the lens of unique harms to hospitals. And I'm confident that we're going to make progress on that front. Each of us already has been doing tremendous work, and I think bringing all these piece parts together, focused on this one goal, is exactly the right approach. So I want to thank Congress for sort of calling for this group, and obviously Chairman Pai for convening, and the staff for selecting such sort of an august group that will enable us to make progress. So thanks.
Thank you very much, Commissioner Carr. It's our honor and our privilege. All right, next we're going to hear from Commissioner Noah Phillips of the Federal Trade Commission. Welcome this morning, Commissioner.
Thank you, Donna. Thanks for having me. It really is an honor to be here. I want to begin by echoing the thanks that Commissioner Carr gave just a moment ago to Chairman Pai for convening this group and for inviting me and all of the amazing people that are part of this group, to the staff at the FCC for coordinating this, and to Congress for having the vision to bring together. I think it was John Riggi who was talking about the unique strength of public and private forces together. The general problem of robocalls and the specific problem of robocalls at hospitals are too great for government alone to face. And so it is inspiring to hear the kind of depth and the kind of breadth brought together under the rubric of the Hospital Robocall Protection Group. At the FTC, there is literally no issue about which we hear more than robocalls. We have a pretty extensive system for gathering complaints, and it shouldn't be surprising to anyone that complaints about robocalls top the list. So this is something we spend a lot of time thinking about. With that in mind, I do also want to introduce Will Maxon, who's here with me. He's one of our in-house experts on robocalls and is a soldier on the front lines fighting this scourge every day. As an agency, the Federal Trade Commission has really focused on three strategies to help fight robocalls. The first is aggressive law enforcement, with a particular emphasis on the people who facilitate robocalls. As we all know, the robocallers themselves are often too numerous and too far outside our jurisdiction for law enforcement to make an impact. But we found a way to make that impact, and I think that's important. A second, as you heard earlier from Aaron Foss, the winner of a contest we held already too many years ago, back in 2013, is encouraging the development of technological tools to help consumers in the private sector to stop calls. And finally, of course, robust consumer and business outreach. We've done a lot of enforcement. I'll focus on that in my remarks. About 148 cases, naming close to 500 businesses and 400 individuals as defendants, and collecting $1.5 billion in judgments. Being awarded $1.5 billion in judgments and collecting over $150 million. Last year, we got together with 25 federal, state, and local agencies in Operation Call It Quits to bring nearly 100 cases against defendants. And we've sued a large voice over the internet provider for assisting in facilitating fraudulent credit card rate reduction program, again, focusing on the companies and individuals that make illegal robocalls happen. This work can't take all the credit, but there has been some reduction that we've observed of late. And of course, it's been great as COVID has started to work with our partners at the FCC to put VoIP providers on notice for what we expect of them and what we expect them not to do. I'll just end with reiterating what I said at the beginning. It is already to listen to the biographies and the accomplishments of the people on this call inspiring to hear about the work that is getting done, but more work needs to get done. These calls, as we've heard repeatedly on this call, to hospitals are not just an annoyance, but a real threat to public safety and to human life. And so I am very excited to get moving. We've got a short deadline, but this is important work, and I look forward to working with each and every one of you.
Thank you, Commissioner Phillips. We also look forward to working with you. It's our honor and our privilege. Thank you, all the members. We're definitely looking forward to working with all of you. So I did promise you all a 10-minute break, but now it looks like it's going to be 5. So we'll meet you back here in 5 minutes at 11 when we'll talk about working group chairs and assignments. So just mute your phone. No need to log off the phone bridge or WebEx, and we'll just see you back here in 5 minutes. And we are back. As you've heard, there will be 3 working groups. Each group will have a chairperson, and each group will be composed of 1 person from each of the 6 member categories enumerated in the TRACE Act. Working Group 1 will address how voice service providers and other entities can better combat unlawful robocalls made to hospitals. Working Group 2 will address how hospitals can better protect themselves from such calls, including by using unlawful robocall mitigation techniques. Working Group 3 will address how the federal government and state governments can help combat such calls. We have assigned for each of the 3 working groups, we have assigned chairs for each of the 3 working groups. For Working Group 1, the chair will be Joseph Delato. Joseph is Vice President of Voice and Unified Communications Products at Charter Communications. For Working Group 2, the chair will be John Ricci, Senior Advisor for Cybersecurity and Risk at the American Hospital Association. Can you please mute your phone? For Working Group 3, the chair will be Creasy Johnson, Special Deputy Attorney General at the North Carolina Attorney General's Office. Commissioners Carr and Phillips will each be on 2 of the working groups. I will now identify the proposed members of each working group, after which time we will open the floor for discussion of these proposed assignments. Please raise your hand if you wish to speak, and we will take questions and comments at the end. If there are no questions or comments, we'll just move on. All right, so Working Group 1, Commissioner Carr, Aaron Foss, Dr. Irene Leach, Chris Shipley, Wissam Naum, and Richard Lovich. Working Group 2, Commissioner Phillips, John Cunningham, Mark Collier, John Brayo, Rebecca Johnson, David McCoy. Working Group 3, Commissioner Carr, Commissioner Phillips, Dave Summit, Linda Vanderloop, Patrick Halley, Deweet Kasai, and Gunnar Halley. Okay, so please raise your hand if you have any questions or comments at this time. So we will be reaching out to you through your chairs of each of these working groups so that we can further answer any questions. So, anything that you don't think of today, we can certainly get answered for you in more details coming up. So I see your question, Irene, about getting a written list. Certainly, we will definitely do that. And like I said, we will be reaching out with additional information in writing, and everything is going to be coordinated through the chair, vice chair of the group, as well as through the working group chairs. All right, so I'm scrolling through looking for any hands raised, and I see none. So I am going to move on to the next thing on our agenda, which is the Federal Advisory Committee Act overview by Paula Silbertow, who is an attorney advisor in our Office of General Counsel. Paula, are you there?
I just got in. I'm not in the meeting, so I can't see the slides yet, but I will hopefully be there in 1 second. Yes.
Okay, Paula. So let's give Paula 1 minute to get situated.
I hit join, and we'll see that shortly. My video's on. I know I need to turn that off. Okay. I want to hit stop my video, right?
Yes.
Okay. So I'm in there. Are you guys ready? Ready for me?
Yes, we are ready. Go right ahead.
Okay. Now, what I'm not seeing is my first slide. There we go. Okay. So we're gonna. Hi everyone. Welcome. I'm assuming that for some or many of you, this could be your first exposure to federal advisory committees. So I'm just going to give some really basic background information about what the committees are. And then based on things that have happened over the years, I'll give a couple of pointers or focus on things that are issues that could arise. And this will be despite there being a number of slides, it's going to be a fairly short presentation. So when I'm done, if there are any questions you have, I'll be happy to field them. So
Paula, I'm sorry to interrupt. I wanted to mention that Theodore Marcus, who's the deputy chief of the FCC's Disability Rights Office, he is going to be managing the master slide deck. So when you're ready to move to the next slide, just give him a prompt, say next slide, okay?
Sure. So Federal Advisory Committee Act, or FACA, has its own little spot in the United States Code. It's Appendix 2 of Title 5. And it, along with regulations of GSA, governs the operations of most federal advisory committees. There are some committees that are exempted by statute. Yours is not, so it falls under FACA. And the guiding principles are openness in government, which is why we have public meetings. We are required by law to have a diverse and balanced membership, and there's general accountability to the public. Next slide. Theo? Thanks. So while the procedures are very flexible in terms of how we operate the meetings and set up working groups and the like, one thing is not terribly flexible, and that is timely notice. So we are required by law, which is a little hard in the pandemic, to give 15 calendar days.
Hi, guys. What's that?
Calendar days notice.
So did you walk home with you?
No. Whose phone needs to be muted, please?
We good? We muted? Thank you. So we have to give 15 days notice before each full committee meeting, and has to be published in the Federal Register, which is a little tricky during the pandemic because they're sort of backed up. But we also, in trying to be user-friendly, we post things on our website, we send out notices, we try to get the word out about meetings so that anyone who's interested in the subject matter can join in. And just so people know, meetings include anything by electronic means as well, which is what we're experiencing: teleconferences, video conferencing, internet-based conferences, and sometimes it can include, by the way, sort of email discussions. So going back on what I was just saying about meetings, when you will be divided into working groups to work on specific issues that are facing you that you've been assigned to address. At those meetings, you need to keep under a quorum, which we usually define it as, majority. So half of you plus one. So you'll notice when we set up working groups, we always keep it at less than a quorum so that those working group meetings do not inadvertently become full parent committee meetings. Okay, next slide. Great. As I just said, VACO requires openness. Committee meetings, full committee meetings have to be open to the public, and people who are attending from the public can submit written statements to the committee and may also speak or address the committee if there is time at the end of the meeting and if the people running the meeting choose to do so. But it's at the FCC's discretion. Okay, next slide. I doubt that you folks, from what I hear, would be having proprietary information or discussing trade secrets or national security matters, but portions of meetings can be closed in advance if you know that something that you're saying is very highly confidential. So if you anticipate, this has to be done in advance, if you anticipate before a meeting happens that there's something that's coming up that would be classified, highly confidential, trade secret, whatever, please get in touch with Donna or Eliza, your DFOs, so that they can get in touch with me. There's a whole procedure for closing certain parts of meetings. But one thing we can't do is at the last minute say, after announcing that a meeting is open, then suddenly saying, no, we need to be private for the next 15 minutes. So it has to be done in advance if you need to close part of a meeting. And please, if you see that kind of issue arising, please let us know. Thank you. Next slide. Great. So under FACA, we have to have minutes of meetings, which can be satisfied by an accessible tape recording of the meeting. And we also keep copies and make them available to the public of all documents that have been received by the committee. And these, even without a FOIA request, can be made publicly available if someone wants to see what's happening with the committee. And just as an aside, should you ever have documents that you are working on that you feel should be protected from disclosure, again, let Donna or Eliza know in advance. So like if you're circulating something within your working group, but you think it's confidential or it reveals information, about your organization that should be kept private, let them know, because you would want to have a non-disclosure procedure for that, which we could work on, and you would also need to specially mark those documents, because otherwise documents and information that's distributed among members would otherwise be anticipated to be made public. Okay. Next slide. Okay, next slide. Right. So communications, the committee chair and vice chair of your group are really important. They can be one of your focal points as you proceed. And if you have questions about what's happening, you can both reach out to your committee chair or vice chair, and also I would recommend to Donna and Eliza. The chairs will help establish your informal working groups, and within those working groups, by the way, you'll probably have leaders or chairs that are designated. Next slide. Okay, your designated federal officer is Donna, and her assistant is Eliza, and their duties sort of broadly include everything. They will call the meetings. They should be consulted about all agendas. They'll help establish the agendas in coordination with the Bureau and approve them in advance of the meeting. One of them will probably be attending all of your working group meetings as well. They will help to maintain all the committee records. And as I believe someone has previously mentioned to you, and this is important, the DFO, Donna, should be copied on every single email communication pertaining to the business of the committee or its working groups. And also my understanding is that there's been a box, an official email site that's been set up that should be copied on all of your communications, either for the full committee or for your working groups. Donna, is that right? Has that been set up already?
Yes, the box is hrpg@fcc.gov, and the box for your purposes is for record keeping. So you just want to copy that box on all of your communications, and then that record would be considered saved.
Okay. And Tony will be talking to you a little bit more about record keeping, but since we are required by law to keep copies of all communications in the business of the FACA, everything should just be sent to that box along with whoever else you're sending it to. Okay, next slide. Tony will get into this more, but our records are maintained in accordance with a specific general records schedule. And the schedule, which is GRS 6.2, is media neutral, so it applies to all records, paper, electronic, audiovisual. So regardless of the format, we need to comply with that record schedule, and your each member sending emails that include the official email box will help us meet these compliance obligations. Okay, next slide. Let's see. So this sort of just follows up on that. Committee members need to make sure the DFO has complete and accurate records showing the committee's activities and those of the working groups, including all deliberations and decisions. So in the working groups, you'll be working on some recommendations and guidelines, and as you distribute the emails on that, please include the DFO, as I said before, and please include the formal box we've set up for maintaining records. Okay, next slide. Now, it's really important to distinguish between your informal working groups or subcommittees and the full FACA. And the reason this distinction's, and that's why we keep the working groups at less than a majority number of members than the full committee. Because the key thing here is the working groups can meet informally and do not have to, and do not in practice have open meetings, because as long as you're a working group, you're less than a majority, you're not subject to the open meeting piece of the FACA requirements. So, what do you do as part of informal working groups? You gather information, but you cannot do this through formal surveys. We'll get to that later. But gather information. You can research things. You can, pull stuff out of your organization's files and share it with each other. You would develop working plans or recommendations, draft reports, and you'll give, preliminary findings on the matters that you're working on. Next slide, please. But the key thing here is that a working group simply submits recommendations to the full parent committee. A working group cannot substitute itself for the full committee, and cannot should not be sending things directly to the commission saying, dear commissioners or whatever, dear world, this is what we recommend. Anything from the working group will then be sent to the full parent advisory committee to be evaluated, discussed, and voted on at a full committee meeting. So since your meetings and the working groups will be closed, you don't want to, by accident, turn yourself into a parent committee. Because since the meetings were closed, if you started to function like a parent committee and issuing statements to the world and trying to bind the parent committee, then your activities would be in violation of the Advisory Committee Act. So the key thing here is a working group just makes recommendations. It reports to the full committee. It cannot, whoopsie, just lost the slide thing. It cannot function as the de facto parent committee. And when your working group recommendations go to the full committee, they need to be closely evaluated by everyone, modified if that's the will of the committee, and they should not be rubber stamped. And any direct recommendations to the FCC need to be made only after a formal vote of the full committee. Okay, next slide. This is what you cannot do. So since the committee and its working groups are sort of considered to be arms of the FCC, or sort of entities established by the FCC, there are things that the rules that apply to certain aspects of the FCC also apply to you folks. So that, unfortunately, includes the Paperwork Reduction Act. And under the Paperwork Reduction Act, of which I'm not an expert, but basically, if the agency, and in this case also the advisory committee or its working groups, decided they wanted to do a survey and reached out to 10 or more entities, or to fewer entities, but that entities that comprise the universe of everyone involved in something, that reach out for the survey would be subject to the PRA, and a PRA survey requires prior approval of OMB, and that approval can take something like 3 to 6 months. So obviously, given your time frame, there would not be time to get approval to do a survey. So if you feel that you want to do, but there are ways of handling this, if you feel that you want to do some sort of a reach out to get more information generally from the public about certain issues. There are often some ways of doing this. If questions to the public are general enough, they are not considered to be surveys. And there are people in the Office of General Counsel who specialize in PRA, and if there is something on which you would like some generic input from the public, or even from a couple of targeted groups, it is often possible to formulate the outreach in such a way as that it steers clear of and does not trigger the PRA. So if you have that situation, please let Donna or Eliza know in advance what areas you're interested in getting maybe some more input or information on, and we can hook you up with the person in OGC who works on PRA and see if you can formulate some open-ended questions that would not be considered, quote, survey questions. And then those open-ended questions, for example, could be posted, among other things, on the website that's established for your advisory group. And I'm sort of emphasizing this boring issue because this has come up a lot over the past year. So we've helped people come up with open-ended questions that would not be considered survey questions under the PRA. Okay, next slide. Okay, I said this earlier, meetings of the working groups are not subject to the open meeting and public notice requirements of VACA. And to help make sure that they're working group meetings and not full committee meetings, attendance should be by less than a quorum of the full committee. Okie doke. Next slide. Right. So some of you may have, if you've participated in commission proceedings, you may have heard about our ex parte rules, which essentially mean that when we have an open proceeding, a rulemaking going on, typically, that any communications with the decision makers, whether that's FCC staff or the commissioners, that there should be a public record of that. And sometimes people simply submit comments, and those go on a website, and they're automatically public. Other times people come in to talk to staff or commissioners. And if people come in to speak to the decision makers, then within a short period after that meeting, they're required to submit, under our ex parte rules, a letter, usually a page or two, summarizing the substance of that meeting. However, typically for our advisory committees, and this will probably be done fairly soon by your DFO or by the Bureau, the Bureau or Commission will waive the ex parte requirements when people on your group, either the working group or the full committee, are giving information to our decision makers about the views of the working group or the committee, as those views may affect a pending rulemaking. Now, I just want to mention, if, for example, you are a member of the advisory committee, but you wish to speak to a commissioner about a rulemaking, not wearing your advisory committee hat, but wearing your private organization hat, then the exemption would not apply to communications, again, where you're wearing your private organization had. But the way we will write the waiver is that it would apply to communications when you're basically speaking on behalf of your work on the advisory committee. In addition, if such communications happen and the commission at some point would be relying on a private conversation you have as a member of the group, that at some later date, that the contents, the substance of that conversation would be put on the record by commission staff. So it's just that, but until that point, you folks would not have to worry about submitting ex partes. So basically, commission staff will handle that for you as long as you're acting in your role as a member of the advisory group. Okay. Next slide. Okay. So this slide here that you're seeing just says, yeah, we'll typically issue an exemption notice, so you don't have to worry about submitting ex partes right now. Okay. Next slide. Next slide. Okay. This is just a little practical issue that sometimes comes. Whoops. Are we okay? Are we there?
I'm here. Everyone okay?
Yep.
Okay, sorry.
Yes.
Wonderful.
Yep.
All right, so the final slide here is on speaking about individual views versus committee views. This happens from time to time because sometimes we're working on sort of hot topics, and maybe someone is writing for a journal, and you're putting in, you want the world that you're working in to be aware that there's an advisory committee happening on some hot topic, and you might write like a letter to the editor or an opinion piece. Occasionally we've had people who were interviewed on things by local radio or TV stations. So the key thing here is to make sure that if you're submitting something in writing or through an appearance, that you make clear that, well, if it's something in which the full parent committee has already voted, so it's public, it's voted, you're just describing something that has happened and is sort of an official advisory committee recommendation, that's fine if you describe it and explain, it's voted and, this is what it is, that's fine. Often people do this before there's been a vote or someone is asking for your individual views on something, like, do you agree with this recommendation? So the key thing here is if you're speaking about your views as an individual, to please just make clear in your presentation that those would be your individual views, not those of the full committee. And you could also say, this was a recommendation that's public, it's on the website of the X, Y, and Z working group. It hasn't been voted by the full committee. I can only give you my individual view of that proposal, which is, it's great, it needs to be modified, whatever you feel. We're not trying to suppress First Amendment here. We just want to be clear that if you speak publicly to an issue that's pending before the committee, that you make very clear that you're speaking in an individual capacity. The unfortunate occurrence that happened a couple years ago was that someone was the chair of a working group, and that individual apparently, I can't remember what the topic was, but felt very strongly about an issue, but was also very strongly outnumbered. So they did a very long technical piece in some journal explaining what they thought the right approach was, but they didn't make clear that it was their own opinion, and footnote, it was not the majority view, it was the minority view, and then they signed it, Joe Smith, comma, chair of X, Y, and Z working group. So this got quite a bit of publicity, and some people thought it was the official view of the working group, which it wasn't. It hadn't been voted yet. And other people thought it was the official view of the entire committee, which it wasn't, and it created a lot of back and forth and confusion. And so it's just important to make the distinction between individual views versus what's been voted by the group you're serving on. And that covers everything I had to say, and I don't know, I'm happy to take any questions people might have, if you have any.
Thank you, Paula. We'll take questions. Just raise your hand, and I will call on you to speak. Commissioner Phillips, did you have a question or comment?
Yeah, just a quick question, and thank you so much for that brief. I just wanted to clarify, when emails are sent in the context of a working group, which is deliberately designed to be sub-quorum, those emails still need to be copied to Donna and possibly others. Is that correct?
That's correct.
Okay.
Yeah, I know there's like a sort of a tension between it's sort of closed and not public, but for record, and Tony can get into this more, but my understanding for record-keeping purposes, Donna should be copied, and the official advisory committee email box should be copied.
Thank you.
So we have a copy of it. They would not necessarily be automatically disclosed to the world, but we are required to keep, those copies. Sure.
If you should, this is Donna. If you should send an email and, afterwards you go, oops, I forgot to copy HRPG at fcc.gov, you can always just go back and forward it to that mailbox. But we have the responsibility to keep those records. Any other questions? I'm scrolling through looking for hands. So seeing none, I'm going to move on. All right, so Tony McGowan from the FCC's Office of Managing Director will continue our discussion of federal advisory committees. Tony, are you there?
I am. Good morning. I'm Tony McGowan, and I'm the agency records officer. For the Federal Advisory Committee records, Paula has been extremely good in delivering just a few key points that I have that are to be maintained in accordance with the General Records Schedule 6.2, which is specific to the Federal Advisory Committee records. Donna Cyrus is the designated federal official for the Hospital Robocall Protection Group, and she'll share an electronic copy of the disposition authority that outlines all the different types of documentation that will be required for us to accession to the National Archives in accordance with the retention schedule or at the termination of this committee, whichever sooner. And my understanding is it's a pretty quick FACA. So the disposition schedule, as Paula mentioned, is the GRS 6.2, and it is media neutral, which means it covers all records regardless of the format. However, to comply with a December 31st, 2022 NARA, which is the National Archives and Records Administration deadline, all documentation going forward is to be electronic, with the exception of any meetings that will be recorded, and those will be in a digital format that will comply with the National Archives requirements. We work directly with Jeff Reardon and his AV staff here at the Commission for all meetings recorded, audio, video, whatever. So what does this mean to all of you? Actually, for you guys, it's really easy. All you'll be required to do from a record-keeping perspective is to ensure that the DFO, Donna, has a complete and accurate record that the documents that the committee deliberates on and decides on, she gets. And we've made this pretty simple. Every committee member must copy the DFO on all the emails pertaining to the business of the committee or its working groups. To do this, we created a mailbox specific to this FACA, and that is the hrpg@fcc.gov. Donna will send out an email from this mailbox with the FACA GRS schedule, and then that way you'll have it. To capitalize on what Paula had said before about the question from the commissioner about the working group emails, this gets a little convoluted because emails are in and of itself a separate type of record. So all emails are considered permanent in a FACA. So we have to maintain those and we have to accession them. If they pertain to a working group, those will be excluded if there were ever any FOIA or e-discovery requests. I hope that makes sense. If not, just let me know. That essentially is your responsibilities. Most of the record-keeping responsibilities for the FACA will fall to Donna. So as long as she has a copy of everything that goes back and forth, emails, documents within emails, we're all set. Does anyone have any questions? Okay. All right, so if anybody does have any questions after the fact, please feel free to send them to Donna and she can get with me. If you don't need anything further, I'm happy to sign out.
I don't see any questions, Tony. Thank you very much. That was very informative. And with regards to the presentations by both Paula and Tony, if something comes up later, anytime you think of it, just please reach out. I know it was a lot of information, but we're here to help, and we will pass any of those questions on to our two speaker experts. Thank you again, Tony, and thank you, Paula. So we are going to move along. We are right on time for our next presentation. Group Chair Dave Summit will now give us a presentation on robocalls in the hospital setting. As you may know, Dave previously gave congressional testimony at a 2019 House Energy and Commerce Subcommittee on Communications and Technology hearing. Go ahead, Dave. We are looking forward to your presentation.
Thank you, Donna. So as she mentioned, last year I was asked to give a testimony in front of that committee on impacts of the robocalls to healthcare operations. Leading up to that, we reached out to several organizations throughout the nation about the problem to try to get an understanding of how widespread it was and what types of methods were being used that was causing interruptions in healthcare. And we received an overwhelming number of responses from different organizations, which were included. Those organizations were also identified at the end of my testimony. That was performed by reaching out to the healthcare ISAC, and it was obviously that's exactly the purpose of the ISAC is collaboration and information sharing. So it worked really well for that. So next slide. So real quick, that overview. I'm the Chief Information Security Officer for Moffitt Cancer Center and Research Institute. We're located in Tampa, Florida. We are the third busiest standalone cancer hospital in the United States and one of 49 National Cancer Institute's designated comprehensive care center. We continue to grow, and we continue to see things that are happening with healthcare in this arena, as well as a wide range of cyber threats in all other areas as well. So we do have a technologically identified epidemic, and that is this robocall problem within healthcare. These are unsolicited, fraudulent, and malicious telephone calls, and they are much more than just a nuisance and an annoyance. They have the potential to be extremely disruptive and potentially dangerous and life-threatening to our patients. They are serious threats, and I want to be quick to point out that even though we're talking healthcare, it's not just healthcare. It is against every critical infrastructure in the United States. These calls disrupt business operations in every sector. They do facilitate financial fraud, among other things, and they take advantage of our senior population through fear and bullying tactics. Next slide. So robocalls, here we're in a situation where robocalls, obviously, there's, along with all good technology comes the method of bad actors taking advantage of good technology and using it for bad. Robocalls were usually associated with marketing firms to solicit people by auto dialing through a database of phone numbers. Very legitimate purpose, very, very honest in initial need. The technology now, again, is making it easier for that same technology to be used for malicious activity. Spam calls, unsolicited calls, which are used more frequently by threat actors with intent to do harm, are really taking off on this. Nearly all malicious intent calls are spoofed, which means that the caller is not who they claim to be, or by caller ID, they're telling you that they are someone else with intent of getting you to answer that phone call. And once you've answered the phone call, then that's when the problems can start taking off. From a healthcare perspective, we have three issues. Calls came into our organization identified on caller ID as coming from within our own organization. So if you can imagine healthcare workers that are on the patient floors taking care of our patients, or financial groups that are taking care of normal operations, and you look down at your caller ID on an incoming phone call, and you see that it's coming from someplace else in Moffett, you have a reasonable expectation when you pick up that phone that you're actually talking to somebody else within Moffett. That was not the case that was going on in early last year. Those calls were actually being spoofed as looking like coming from legitimate extensions, even from within our own institution. So that's the first situation. The second situation is we were having calls placed to individuals throughout our state and actually across country that was using our name as the caller ID with intent to gather other types of information, specifically and kind of fearfully was the caller was trying to get additional information, personal information, or insurance information or other health information from those individuals in our name. And the third situation was calls to specific individuals inside our organization, mainly to our providers, to obtain confidential information used to carry out further activity. These calls are usually identified as a U.S. Department of Health entity or other federal agency. So when our people try to see those numbers and look them up, they just got very concerning because they thought these were official notifications or official phone calls. So from a healthcare perspective, for the 3 months that led up to my testimony, and this is basically the first quarter of last year, we received well over 6,600 calls meeting those three previous criteria. Those calls, without including any type of telecom investigation or my team's investigation in what these calls were, those calls all consumed about 60 hours of response time. And what that means is we pulled logs of all of our incoming phone calls, and in those logs tells us how long each call lasts. So out of all of those, we added up all that time, and it was an astounding 65 hours of nonstop response time. So also concerning a part of those 6,600 calls, 300 of them came in within just a few week period that identified themselves as government agencies in the Washington, D.C. area out of the 202 area code. The U.S. Justice Department was used, their name was used as a caller ID in an attempt to extract information from our providers. And what they would be doing would be wanting to know our provider. They knew who they were specifically targeting. And they would identify themselves as people from the U.S. Justice Department needing to speak with that provider about usually his national information provider number, and trying to get other information specific to that individual provider. Next slide. So since that testimony, as a follow-up, we saw a decrease in these numbers, and we were kind of contributing that decrease in the amount of attention that was getting after that committee meeting, because we, and myself included, we had just caused a media firestorm out of all this. We were in newspapers and TV all across the nation right after that, with letting everyone know what was going on. And I think that attention alone caused a stop, or at least a slowdown with our organization for a while. Since January of this year, these calls are increasing again, but we're seeing it mainly due to the COVID-19 pandemic, because they're more related to that. And as a matter of fact, last week when I was preparing this real quick presentation, I was called by another employee in our organization, very upset. She said she had received a call, and it identified itself as the U.S. Department of Health, specifically the pharmacy. She was a pharmacist, and they called or identified themselves as from the U.S. Department of Health, and they were there to talk to her about her actions and stuff, doing what she was doing in the narcotics area. And it was very concerning because she was told she needed to call back the number and talk to and gave a name. They called him Officer John. And when she did actually call back, she was meted with another person on the end of her phone that was very antagonistic. In fact, told her that if she didn't cooperate with these questions, they would be sending an officer over for an immediate arrest. And of course, when I heard this, the first thing I did was get with the telecom people to find out what's going on here, and are there any other calls coming in. And there were a few other the same calls being placed in different parts of the organization. So we knew immediately this was a spoofed call, but it was something that was just very upsetting and something that's just not needed. Next slide. So why are these threats? Why are these a threat to healthcare? First, they disrupt workflow. That's one of the biggest things. It's a situation where they can, with massive spamming coming into a healthcare organization, it can cause a denial of service on the telephone system. So once you take a telephone system out of healthcare, you have a really serious problem of being able to reach in emergency situations, or even communications from doctors to patients, and providers to patients, and patients back in. So they do tie up phone lines for legitimate calls. They can cause a denial of service. And in many cases, these denial of service can be life-threatening in certain situations where the provider's been delayed or is unable to receive a legitimate phone call. Next slide. So just to quickly wrap this up, I actually used Chairman Doyle's words in another one of his committee meetings after I started trying to do investigations of everything that the government was trying to do with this, and he put it very succinctly. We have an opportunity to collaborate, discuss, and recommend actions that can put into place 21st century rules for a 21st century technology. It is just so important that in today's technological age, we do have the capability to help put down this threat. And I don't think anybody would disagree in saying that when we pick up a phone call or we receive a phone call from someone and that caller ID is someone specific, there is no unreasonable expectation to be able to pick up the phone and believe I'm talking with the person on that caller ID. And if we can get to that point, then it puts the onus back on the receiver of the call to make the decision by looking at a caller ID and say, yes, I want to answer that call, or no, I do not want to answer that call. At the same time, I think our charge is to also look at potential impacts and the ramifications that we could possibly be imposing that may cause problems in other legitimate types of phone calls. So I'm really looking forward, and I'm very honored to work with this group. As we went through all of these people introducing themselves, I am pleased and very happy and just astounded at the amount of knowledge and wisdom that we may have through this group. So I'm looking very forward to working with everyone and getting this accomplished. so we can have a successful group of recommendations and best practices moving forward. So with that, Donna, I'm going to turn it right back over to you.
Okay, thank you, Dave. Just to clarify, the Chairman Doyle that we're talking about is Chairman of the House Telecom Subcommittee. Dave, that was really wonderful, and it really gives scope, the extent of this problem. So we're looking forward to tackling that with you. Do we have any questions for Dave? Okay, so seeing none, I am going to call a break for lunch, and we pick up that extra 5 minutes that we lost earlier. So there you have it. We are going to come back here at 1 p.m. after lunch. And you can leave your WebEx on, but if you want to jump off the call, you can do that. And we'll still be here. The FCC staff will still be here on the call, so you can jump back on the call anytime that you like. So with that, let's take a break for lunch, and we will see you back here at 1 p.m. Thanks, everyone. Thank you, Dave. Welcome back to the Hospital Robocall Protection Group inaugural meeting. Just a reminder for everyone to please mute your phone. There's a lot of background noise right now, so that would be really helpful. Thank you all so much. We now have 3 more quick presentations from our FCC staff robocall experts, and we'll take a break after the second one. But first up is Jerusha Burnett of the FCC's Consumer Policy Division of the Consumer and Governmental Affairs Bureau. Jerusha has just recently worked on the Commission's call blocking item and will discuss our rules on call blocking. Welcome, Jerusha. Happy to have you.
Thank you so much, and good afternoon, everyone. I hope you're having a good and productive first meeting. So if we want to flip to the call blocking slides, I can get started. So I'm going to talk through the Commission's rules on call blocking and also a little bit on how the Commission has looked at call blocking so far and made some of these decisions. So, a first threshold question whenever you talk about call blocking is to ask, why would you want to block calls, right? Consumers want to receive calls. There's call completion rules to require that those calls reach consumers. So what is the reason for blocking? Well, the reason for blocking is, of course, the vast number of illegal and unwanted calls that traverse the network every day.
Just the way that you're saying it, it's like, so you might want to.
I'm sorry, Jerusha. I just need to do another reminder to everyone on the call to please mute your phones. Someone is typing, and there are other background noises as well. So we really appreciate that. Thank you so much. All right, Jerusha. Sorry for the interruption. Go ahead, please.
No worries at all. So, as I said, the clear answer to that is, of course, the vast number of robocalls that reach consumers every day that are illegal or, at the very least, unwanted. So the goal with call blocking is to stop those unwanted and illegal calls before they reach the intended recipient, which can prevent annoyance in the case of an unwanted call, tying up the line in the case of unwanted or an illegal call, right? Because if you need important calls to go through and the line's all tied up, those calls don't go through. And they also prevent potential fraud, which is a very key part of the Commission's decision-making on a lot of this. But as I mentioned, the Commission has also shown the desire to exercise caution in these decisions. There are a lot of important calls that we really don't want to have blocked, particularly where the recipient might not know the call is being blocked. So for a couple contact examples that might work in the medical context, this could be an appointment reminder to a patient to ensure that the patient gets the care they need. But it could also be a situation where the patient is trying to reach the medical provider, and maybe the patient's number has been hijacked by a scammer, and the patient's calls could get blocked because a scammer is also placing scam calls from the same number. So the Commission has tried to keep this balance in mind and has worked to get it correct. So a consumer, of course, has the right to refuse any call they want. Even if that's that appointment reminder, the consumer can say, I don't want to receive it. That's their prerogative. They can simply not answer the phone. But we don't want voice service providers to block calls without the recipient's input unless there's a really good reason. This is further complicated by things like caller ID spoofing, which is the hijacking of the patient's phone number that I was talking about earlier, because that could mean that both legal and illegal calls appear to originate from the same number. And these can be difficult for both a service provider and a call recipient to distinguish. Now, I know one of my colleagues will be talking about this shaken caller ID authentication framework after me, and that is a framework that is designed in part to address some of these spoofing issues. So that's sort of the background of what the Commission wants to consider in a very broad sense when making call blocking decisions. So I'm going to take you through a little bit of what the Commission has done in the call blocking context. And this goes back as far as the 2015 Omnibus TCPA declaratory ruling. That ruling clarified that nothing in the Communications Act or the Commission's implementing rules prohibits carriers or voice over IP providers from implementing consumer-initiated call blocking technology that can help consumers stop unwanted calls. This goes back to what I said earlier of the fact that a customer has the right to block calls. They have the right to refuse to receive a call, and this is basically saying they can sort of delegate that right to their provider, right? So their provider can block calls on their behalf with their authorization. Providers, in order for this work correctly, the providers must accurately disclose that some of the calls the consumer might want could be blocked. The hijacking example is a good example there as well. If my phone number were to be hijacked and I was trying to call, someone, then my call might be blocked as well as the calls from the scammer who'd hijacked my number might be blocked. So it's very important for the recipient to know if they're opting into call blocking that that could happen, that they might miss calls they want to receive. The Commission took this a little further in the 2017 call blocking order. That order outlines specific and well-defined circumstances where voice service providers can block calls without consumer consent. So this is a little different from the 2015 Omnibus TCPA declaratory ruling, which required consumer consent and was in essence to saying, well, the consumer can delegate to the provider. This is saying the provider can block in very specific instances without that delegation. These categories of numbers are numbers that should not be used to originate calls, and that the caller would have to be spoofing. So the Commission stated that these calls are presumptively illegal. These include a couple categories. The first is the do not originate request category. So this is blocking where the subscriber to the number requests that all calls purporting to originate from that number be blocked. This can only really work in the context of call-in numbers. So the sort of quintessential example here is the IRS hotline number, which scammers were spoofing to obtain some legitimacy to their calls, right? Because, if they're pretending to be the IRS, this looks like the call's coming from the IRS. I can Google this number is the IRS. I better listen to them. It doesn't work, however, where the subscriber to the number makes outbound calls from that number, because those outbound calls would also be blocked. The other categories of calls were the blocking of calls purporting to originate from unassigned numbers. So these include invalid numbers, unallocated numbers, or numbers that have been allocated but are unused. The theory for this is that no subscriber can originate from these numbers without spoofing the number, and that if they are originating from these numbers, there's no way for the recipient to call back. So there's no reason for these calls to be lawful because there's no way to get back to the caller. So moving forward a couple of years, we have the 2019 call blocking declaratory ruling. So this item provided clarity on certain call blocking services that can be offered with consumer consent. In the first part of it, builds on the 2015 Omnibus Declaratory Ruling by making clear that providers can offer call blocking services based on reasonable analytics designed to identify unwanted calls to their customers on an informed opt-out basis. So the 2015 declaratory ruling could have been read to mean the consumer must opt in to this service. The 2019 declaratory ruling basically says, in the case of a blocking service based on reasonable analytics designed to identify unwanted calls, it's actually okay if the provider turns that service on by default and the consumer has to opt out in order for calls not to be blocked. This is designed to recognize that inertia can lead to low adoption rates for opt-in programs, even when consumers are upset about receiving unwanted and illegal calls. Also, side note on reasonable analytics. So the commission did not define reasonable analytics with specificity. Instead, they stated that it could include a number of factors, including but not limited to a large burst of calls in a short time frame, a low average call duration, low call completion ratios, or invalid numbers placing a large volume of calls. Of course, the last one could also be blocked at the network level without consumer consent under the 2017 order as well. That brings us forward to the 2020 call blocking order, which just came out. So it's all fresh and new. It was issued earlier this month on July 16th, and it adopts two safe harbors for voice service providers that block calls. Both of these safe harbors provide protection from liability under the Communications Act and the Commission's rules for providers that meet the criteria to claim the safe harbor. The first safe harbor continues to build on the 2019 declaratory ruling and incorporates caller ID authentication to provide protection from liability for voice service providers that block based on reasonable analytics, which must include caller ID authentication information. And the reasonable analytics must be designed to identify unwanted calls, and they can be offered on an informed opt-out basis. So we talked about the 2019 declaratory ruling, opt-out blocking of calls based on reasonable analytics designed to identify unwanted and illegal calls. The 2020 order says, okay, you want additional protection from liability, you also need to incorporate caller ID authentication information. That is the main distinction from the 2019 declaratory ruling. So the question is then, what is including caller ID authentication information, right? Well, at a minimum, a terminating voice service provider that wanted this safe harbor protection must have deployed an effective caller ID authentication framework within their own network, accept caller ID authentication information transmitted by an upstream voice service provider, and incorporate that information into analytics where that information is available. The terminating voice service provider may also rely on this safe harbor even when blocking calls where caller ID authentication information is not available, so long as it incorporates that information wherever possible. So as you may hear from my colleague coming up next, there's the STIR-SHAKEN framework. The STIR-SHAKEN framework is currently the only framework that the Commission has said is an effective caller ID authentication solution under the Trace Act. So it is the only framework that can be used here as well. So not all providers have deployed STIR/SHAKEN to date. And in fact, some providers, it might take quite some time because they are on TDM networks, not on IP networks. For this reason, the Commission didn't want to say, you can't block calls where there's no authentication information, because that would encourage bad actors to simply find providers that aren't signing calls because maybe they can't deploy STIR/SHAKEN or they've got a delay in deploying STIR/SHAKEN and use those providers so they can get around that blocking. So you can still use it, but where it's available, you have to take it into consideration. There is also a second safe harbor in this 2020 order. This safe harbor provides protection when a voice service provider blocks all traffic from certain upstream voice providers that are considered bad actors. Now, this is a fairly specific safe harbor. The Commission has to notify a provider of illegal traffic on their network. And then that provider has to fail to either one of these is a failure, fail to effectively mitigate this traffic, or fail to implement effective measures to prevent new or renewing customers from using their network to originate illegal calls. If that provider fails to do either one of these things, a downstream provider may block calls from them. The order also directs that bad actor provider who is running the risk of getting their calls blocked to notify both the Traceback Consortium and the Commission of the steps they have taken to effectively mitigate the illegal traffic within 48 hours. And we also do expect the downstream provider to notify the bad actor before they start blocking calls, because that could allow the bad actor to maybe take further steps if what they are doing hasn't actually been effective. So all of that is ways in which voice service providers can block calls. But as I noted, the Commission is fairly cautious to try to avoid the blocking of wanted or even important calls. So the Commission has also adopted some protections around call blocking. These protections, some of them are built in to the blocking we talked about. So blocking involving consumer consent, the consumer can just opt out of that blocking if they find they aren't receiving calls they want. That's somewhat of a built-in protection. But there are also specific protections. The Commission has said, do not block calls to 911, and that has been stated as far back as the 2015 Omnibus Declaratory Ruling, and was reiterated again in 2017 and again in 2020. There are also some protections for emergency calls. The 2019 Declaratory Ruling stated that voice service providers should make all feasible efforts for these tools to avoid blocking emergency calls. And the 2020 order directed voice service providers to make all reasonable efforts to ensure that calls from PSAPs, so public safety answering points, and government outbound numbers are not blocked. The order noted that some unwanted and illegal calls will reach 911 call centers, but that the Commission is certain that the call centers themselves are better equipped to determine how to handle those calls than the voice service provider. The 2020 order also added a point of contact requirement. This requirement asks voice service providers to designate a single point of contact to report blocking errors at no charge to callers or other voice service providers. Blocking providers must investigate and resolve these disputes in a reasonable amount of time and at no cost to the caller, so long as the complaint is made in good faith. So those are the protections currently in place. What are some next steps? Well, the 2020 order also had a further notice. This further notice seeks comment on further implementation of the Trace Act, including additional blocking and related safe harbors, as well as further protections for callers. We are currently working on getting that NPRM published in the Federal Register, at which time we will announce comment dates for the item. but that is yet to come. So if anyone has any questions, I'm happy to answer them. I'm guessing the last lack of questions is that no one has any questions unless someone's trying to ask and is mute. Oh, wait, there's that list. Hold on, let me look. Yeah, looks like no one's raising their hand or anything, so I think that means we don't have any questions.
We can still hear you in case that you're wondering, given the silence.
All right, well, thank you, everybody.
Donna, are you still there? We don't hear you if you are.
I am so sorry, everyone. My phone was on mute and I was busy talking. So I'm a victim of my own. Please mute your phone. Can everyone hear me now?
Yes.
Yes.
Yes, wonderful. Okay, thank you. All right, so I was saying thank you very much to Jerusha for coming and speaking with us fresh off of the call blocking item. I know that was very difficult for her to juggle so much, so we're really appreciative. Next up is Connor Ferraro of the FCC's Competition Policy Division of the Wireline Competition Bureau. Connor will be talking about stir-shaken caller ID authentication. Thank you, Connor. Go right on ahead.
Great. Thank you very much. As Donna said, my name is Connor Ferraro. I also go by CJ, so that's kind of used interchangeably in the slides. I'm an attorney advisor in the Competition Policy Division of the Wireline Competition Bureau. I'm going to be giving some background on the stir-shaken caller ID authentication framework and the Commission's actions related to its implementation. I realize that among the HRPG membership, there's kind of a mix of familiarity with stir-shaken already. Most of my presentation is aimed towards those members new to the topic. So for those already familiar, a lot of what you'll see is review. I'll also have my contact information on the last slide, and I know this can kind of be at times a technical topic. So for any questions I'm unable to answer on the spot, I'm happy to take questions back and circle back with you at a later time. So to begin, I think it's helpful to go over the problem that stir-shaken is designed to solve. I know previous presentations have touched on some of these issues already, both this morning and then Jerusha. So I won't spend too long on this slide, but I'll briefly discuss how we view these ideas in the stir-shaken context. So I think overall, the simplest framing is that the technological advancements in telephony that have benefited consumers in a lot of ways have also been exploited by bad actors. First, as we discussed earlier, it's become easy for bad actors to spoof or falsify their caller ID to further fraud. Although it is important to note that spoofing is not bad per se, and it does have many legitimate uses. Additionally, the advancement of internet protocol, IP-based telephony, has made it much easier to make calls. This has benefited consumers in a lot of ways, to include increased competition and lower prices. But as industry has transitioned from a limited number of carriers that all trust each other to provide accurate caller ID to now a multitude of carriers originating calls, this built-in trust has decreased. Next slide, please. So what is stir-shaken? At a high level, it's a technological framework for IP networks that allows for the authentication of caller ID information. By authenticating caller ID info transmitted with the call, it's putting the trust that I was speaking about back into the infrastructure itself. So who designed stir-shaken, which is going to lead us to an explanation of the name. STIR stands for the Secure Telephony Identity Revisited. which is a working group of the Internet Engineering Task Force, or the IETF. STIR produced protocols for authenticating caller ID information. SHAKEN stands for the signature-based handling of asserted information using tokens. This was created by ADIS, the Alliance for Telecommunications Industry Solutions, and also the SIT Forum. SHAKEN standardized how the STIR protocols are implemented in practice. So thinking about how it works. So there are two, as denoted by the name, there are two big components at play here. The first is the technical process for authenticating and verifying caller ID information. And the second is the social process that ensures that that authentication and verification framework remains trusted. So just to delve a little bit into the technical process, this is an oversimplification of what's happening. But currently, for an IP call that an originating provider starts, it includes the caller ID information, and that will be transited through the call path to the terminating provider. Next slide, please. And so what STIR/SHAKEN is doing is it's adding another piece to that. So the originating provider is also attaching to the call what, for simplicity's sake, we'll group as STIR/SHAKEN information. And that includes an encrypted caller ID information, an originating provider ID, identifying the originating provider, an attestation level, which is A, B, or C. And this attestation level is used to indicate to the terminating provider how certain the originating provider is that the calling party is who they say they are. And finally, a digital certificate. Now, for actually, go back a slide. Great, thanks. I'll let you know. I'll spend a little bit more time here. So what's happening is that if the call path is entirely an IP, then this information travels from the originating provider all the way to the terminating provider. And then the terminating provider uses a process to unencrypt the caller ID information and match it against the already unencrypted version sent with the call, with the idea that when those two are matched up, the caller ID is verified. The attestation level and the origination ID additionally are providing information to the terminating provider about the call and who the call is coming from, and this information has the potential to be used in analytics programs as well as call blocking programs. The certificate piece of this is the piece that ties into the social aspect of STIR/SHAKEN that I was talking about. And now if you go to the next slide. The certificate is essentially saying that the originating provider is who it claims to be, and that the terminating provider can trust the information that it's sent. The assignment and management of the certificates is governed by an industry-led governance system, and that has three parts: a governance authority, it has a policy administrator, and then several certificate authorities. And those three arms work together to maintain the system. Next slide, please. So how does STIR/SHAKEN help? If a call fails verification, it's a high likelihood that it is maliciously spoofed. A terminating provider can choose to share that information with the subscriber. They can choose to block the call or empower the subscriber to block the call. STIR/SHAKEN also provides useful information for call analytics. Some of that includes where the call originated or entered the domestic IP network, what the attestation level the call received. And it can promote traceback efforts and can be used to identify unusual patterns of behavior. Some of the open issues that still remain with STIR/SHAKEN implementation is the application of STIR/SHAKEN to certain unique calling cases, caller ID authentication on non-IP networks, because STIR/SHAKEN is designed to work on IP, and also cross-border caller ID authentication. So to delve a little bit into the FCC action regarding STIR/SHAKEN going back a few years. In 2017, the Commission released a notice of inquiry into STRSHAKEN. It's launching a broad examination of how to expedite its development and implementation. The Commission then directed its Expert Advisory Committee on Numbering, the North American Numbering Council, or the NANCI, to recommend criteria by which a governance authority should be selected, and that goes to the social aspect I was speaking about, and a reasonable timeline or set of milestones for adoption and deployment of STRSHAKEN. In the NANCI's May 2018 report, it made a number of recommendations regarding establishing and organizing a governance system and promoting STRSHAKEN implementation, which Chairman Pai accepted. In November 2018, Chairman Pai sent letters to 14 major voice service providers urging them to implement a robust caller ID authentication framework by the end of the year, by the end of 2019. And in June 2019, the Commission adopted a notice of proposed rulemaking that proposed and sought comment on mandating implementation of STRSHAKEN in the event that major voice service providers did not voluntarily implement by the end of 2019. Then in December, Congress enacted the TRACE Act, which we're all familiar with, that contained a number of provisions about STRSHAKEN, which I'll talk about in a second. And in March 2020, the Commission adopted a report and order and further notice of proposed rulemaking requiring STRSHAKEN and seeking comment on implementing the other parts of the TRACE Act. So regarding STRSHAKEN, the TRACE Act directs the FCC to require voice service providers to implement STRSHAKEN by June 30th, 2021. Some of the caveats in that are an extension in compliance if FCC determines it would present an undue hardship on providers. And providers with this extension must implement a robocall mitigation program in the meantime. There's also an exemption process for providers that the FCC determines have achieved certain implementation benchmarks by December 30, 2020. The TRACE Act directs the Commission to prohibit voice service providers from adding a line item charge for caller ID authentication. And it directs the Commission to require voice service providers to take responsible measures to implement a caller ID authentication for framework on non-IP parts of their networks. So March 2020 report and order and further notice of proposed rulemaking. The report and order establishes that voice service providers must implement STRSHAKEN. It limited this requirement to the IP parts of their network, and the requirement goes into effect June 30, 2021. The further notice of proposed rulemaking proposed granting a one-year extension for small voice service providers, establishing certification process for providers that seek an exemption, prohibiting providers from adding line item charge for caller ID authentication, requiring providers with non-IP network technology to either, one, upgrade their network and implement STRSHAKEN, or work to develop a non-IP caller ID authentication solution. And it proposed extending STRSHAKEN implementation mandate to intermediate providers. So the next steps, the Commission is currently reviewing the record in response to the March further notice. Some deadlines that are on the horizon is the TRACE Act requires the exemption determinations by December 30, 2020. And our implementation mandate goes into effect June 30th, 2021. Just to wrap up, as we've no doubt heard before, there is no silver bullet for stopping robocalls. STRSHAKEN represents one piece of that, one piece of the solution targeted at preventing illegal spoofing. Happy to take any questions now, and like I said, happy to take any questions back and get back to you as well.
Do we have any questions for Connor? I'm just going to slide through and check for any hands raised. Aaron, go ahead, please.
Hey there, just a quick question. Do you know which carriers have actually already implemented this? I know that I've been reading a lot of the press releases and things like that, but what has like the coverage of implementation been up until now?
So I think the press releases that you're referring to are a good indication of where the industry is at. The Commission doesn't have any information more than that at this time. But as I said, there's a exemption process for providers that have reached certain implementation benchmarks that would be put in place this fall. And the commission is currently reviewing the record and figuring out how exactly to structure that process. So the potential for more information to be available by the middle of the year.
Got it. That's great. Thank you.
Okay, I see another question from John Breo.
Hi. Yes. Yes. Thank you, Connor, for that presentation. I am one of the people who benefited greatly from your review of Stir Shaken on this. While I've certainly heard of it from my work, this is the most detailed presentation I've heard of it. So I appreciate you making time to brief us. What I know about Stir Shaken typically has involved how it's being implemented by voice providers who are serving the consumer audience. But I know a number of enterprise level carriers, many of which the sort of the average consumer may not have heard of, are also providing services to large entities, organizations, specifically hospitals. Are you aware of how those entities which are serving hospitals specifically are or are not implementing Stir Shaken? And if they are, have you received any kind of feedback on how that implementation is going? And then the second question is with regards to metrics of sort of success metrics. Does the FCC have any kind of success metrics that they have set for Stir Shaken with regards to, say, percentage of robocalls that get through the network, or anything else that we might be able to look at in terms of figuring out how well it's actually working on the ground level?
Great. So to your first question, that is a common issue that I think we're hearing a lot of the industry talk about, is how exactly enterprise use cases will be incorporated into Stir Shaken. And I know that there are several ideas and standards being proposed and drafted in the industry right now about how exactly to go about that. And so at this time, the commission doesn't have an answer about which is the one going to be used moving forward. But we do know that it is a topic that is being heavily worked on by the industry. As far as success metrics, we don't yet at this time, I think about how to measure the success of Stir Shaken with regards to specifically any type of robocall data. I think we're thinking more about our implementation mandate at June 2021. And so I think all the ideas that you voiced are good ones and ones that I don't have kind of any updates or comments on at this time.
Great, thank you.
Okay, so just a request that if you've raised your hand and had that question answered, lower your hand so when I scroll through, I can see which hands are newly raised. Thank you. I don't see any other new questions. So I just want to thank Connor for his time. And of course, if anyone should think of any questions later for any of our presenters, I'll be happy to take those questions and refer them on to Connor. So thank you again, Connor. All right, we are scheduled for a break right now. So if you all could just give me a verbal yes, I want to know if we feel like we should just power through and skip the break. So just say yes so I can hear what the consensus is.
Yes.
Yes. Keep going.
Yes. Yes.
All right, very good. So we're going to keep going then. Our next speaker is Christy Thompson, Chief of the Telecommunications Consumers Division of the Enforcement Bureau. Christy is also the alternate for Commissioner Carr. She will be speaking about robocall enforcement. Welcome, Christy. Go ahead, please.
Thank you so much. Everybody hear me?
Yes.
Excellent. All right. Thank you very much for the opportunity to speak to you all today. There is nothing more psychologically and spiritually fulfilling than knowing that you're on the front lines of battling robocalls. It's the one experience that binds Americans of all kinds and all places together in their great distaste and unhappiness, and it is a privilege to work on combating them. It's also a privilege to be here today with all of you, learning about. I'm always interested in hearing real life experiences with different segments of industry that are experiencing unique harms, and this related to robocalls, and this is one of those very important segments where the potential risk of harm is even greater than it is for your everyday average consumer. That is, as has been said a couple of times, and I won't belabor too much, but that is ever more pressing now in the midst of a historic global pandemic, when we need hospital staff and our medical personnel who are dedicated to saving lives focused on doing that rather than combating with fraudsters. So what I want to talk about today are some real life approaches that we take generally into combating illegal robocalls and illegal spoofed calls. And I want to talk about this in particular to sort of tee up potential discussions today and further down the line for how we might apply these lessons that we have developed over the past few years in trying to combat illegal traffic, and how we might apply them and integrate the healthcare industry and hospitals in particular into this framework that we have, this enforcement framework that we have created, so that when and if a problematic event rises for a hospital group or a particular hospital, that the hospital folks there, administrators, security personnel, know first of all who to contact as soon as that problem arises and they find out about it, and then secondly that there is a process to help solve that problem, both the immediate problem of getting the call stopped, and then longer term bringing the perpetrators to justice. So I want to talk a little bit about how we find out who is really responsible for a robocall. It is not easy. We've talked, as I think everyone here knows, we've been talking about the problem of spoofed calls. The average consumer, the recipient of a telephone call cannot tell just from the information available to her who actually placed that robocall. You cannot guarantee that the caller ID information is correct, and what that means is that all of us are kind of flailing around trying to figure out who is responsible for making these calls. It's not easy to figure that out. It in fact requires something called a traceback investigation, which is exactly what it sounds like. We have to figure out by tracing backwards, tracing from the destination point back to the true origin point where that call came from. And the way that we do this is to reconstruct the call records, those connection records that multiple carriers hold. It is a kind of a marvel of technological engineering. When you pick up a telephone and you dial the number, and let's say you're using a cell phone, so you press call, it typically takes a handful of seconds. There's a pause, and then you hear the phone start ringing. That connection has been made, and the person on the other end of the line knows that they've gotten the call. But in between the time that you hear the ringing starting and the time that you press send, your telephone call may have passed through up to a dozen different carriers before it finally reached its destination. That is by design. More than 20 years ago, Congress passed the Telecommunications Act of 1996 that opened up competition in the telephone space. That had tremendous positive effects for the economy and for the telecommunications industry, but it also introduced a problem, which was that a previously closed network is no longer closed, and the level of trust that different carriers had with each other does not exist to the same extent that it did previously. And what it also means is that it's no longer possible, now that Ma Bell is long gone, it's no longer possible to go to one place and figure out where a call came from beginning to end. So what we have to do is try and figure that information out through routing information to the call detail records. We can go to the next slide. So here's an example of a fictional traceback chart to show how this works. Here's our evil Vinny villain, Robocall kingpin, who has decided to make a number of illegal robocalls, and he has his own platform dialer. What does that mean? What's a platform dialer? These days, it's literally just a piece of software you can buy on the internet for not very much money at all. A software suite that will help you configure your very own dialer. Please don't do this. At least don't do this please don't do this illegally. There's plenty of people in the business already, and I don't need any more enforcement targets. But it's very cheap. It's very cheap to acquire this software. You put it on a server, you configure it, and ta-da, you are now a robo-dialer. So you see here in this fictional example, Vinny the villain works with a VoIP provider. Typically, the most problematic robocall campaigns that we see are by and large originating through VoIP providers. So they're born on the internet. Those VoIP providers, there may be multiple VoIP providers that the calls get bounced around through before they hit the first telecom there. And you'll see in this example chart, this particular VoIP provider goes through a telecom, and then it gets routed through other VoIPs and other telecoms. And you'll see that network where parts of those calls, in this case, there's about 10,000 calls. Some portion of those 10,000 calls get routed through multiple carriers before they finally reach their destination. So before we had coordinated industry traceback, every time you see on this little fictional chart here, wherever you see a red arrow, that would require a separate issuance of a government subpoena to obtain the information about those calls. And we'd start out at the sort of the top of the page with, let's say, Kathy Consumer, and have to issue a subpoena to Zeta Telecom, and then to Alpha, Beta, and Gamma, and then to Delta and Rho, and then to Phi, and then to Omega, before we finally could figure out that, oh, these calls were made by Vinny Villain. That process alone, years ago, when we first started tackling this, could take months. And each of federal agency and state AG offices were having to try and tackle this alone. The more hops there were between the call recipient and the call originator meant the longer amount of time that it would take government investigators to figure out where the calls were coming from. Then, even worse, if you called your telephone company and said, hey, I want you to stop delivering these calls, your telephone company does not know without coordination through our robocall enforcement process, does not know where the call ultimately came from. They only know where they got the call from. So, for example, if you are a network security person at Zeta Telecom here, and Kathy Consumer says, hey, I have a problem, somebody's calling me, the only thing Zeta could say is that they got Kathy's call from either Alpha, Beta, or Gamma. They wouldn't know anything beyond that level. They wouldn't know that Delta and Rho were involved. They wouldn't know that Phi Telecom was involved. They can only see one level above and one level below themselves. To solve that problem, what we did to solve that problem, next slide here, the telecom industry, and this is where my good friend and ally, Patrick Halley, comes in. created an industry traceback consortium. This is a group of carriers, both Title II carriers and VoIP providers, currently operated by the U.S. Telecom Industries Traceback Group, where providers get together and share information about identified illegal robocalling campaigns in order to trace back quickly where a call came from as far back as possible. So instead of having to have, a dozen or, 24 government subpoenas to individual carriers and providers to find that information, the industry is now sharing that information with each other for the purposes of detecting and stopping fraud. This has been a huge game changer. When we first started out, my most successful traceback that I was so excited about because we pulled out all of the stops. It was a emergency situation. I was so excited that we figured out where the calls were coming from and got them stopped in 3 weeks. Now, these days, with the help of the industry traceback group, we are able to figure out, or providers are able to figure out where those calls are coming from, sometimes in a matter of hours and sometimes in a matter of minutes. That is an incredibly powerful tool that has just changed our ability to attack malicious robocalls and malicious spoofed robocall campaigns in a way that never existed before. The U.S. Telecom's ITG is integrated with the Umail app. If you're familiar with Umail, one of the features of that users of Umail are able to do is to identify calls that they receive that are illegal robocalls, and they send that information to Umail along with it's a voicemail recording. If the robocaller leaves a voicemail, it gets forwarded on to Umail. Umail has permission from its users to take that information and share it with others, and one of the folks that they share that with is the ITG. So there is information out there about here's the robocall campaigns. It's sort of real life crowdsourced. There's good indications that here's a batch of calls. They're all Social Security Administration scam calls. Now the industry traceback group can trace those calls back, figure out where they came from. This saves a tremendous amount of time and resources in figuring out where these calls are coming from. And I want to transition now to talk a little bit about how this process can help in the hospital context. And my favorite example of this, because he had an actual harmful effect on hospitals in particular, is dear Mr. Adrian Abramovich, who is pictured here during his 2018 U.S. Senate testimony. He was hauled before the Senate, and Senator John Thune gave him quite the thrashing in chambers there. Here he is pictured claiming that he is not the robocall kingpin. This shortly after he was identified by us and charged by us with making more than 96 million illegal spoofed robocalls in just 3 months in 2016. It could have been more, but we stopped looking after 3 months because there were so many, it just would have been piling on. His robocalls, significantly disrupted a hospital paging network. So this was a situation where I got an email. Someone from the hospital paging network knew who to contact. They knew that they needed to reach out to the FCC. So they reached out to the FCC through our public safety folks, and our public safety folks then immediately alerted us in the Enforcement Bureau. What we need to do something about this. The hospitals are, as I'm sure many folks on this call know, are some of the last users of pagers that are out there, because those pagers are more reliable than cell phones. They're more reliable than anything. You can always use those pagers. They're very effective in the healthcare context, but they're not effective when the paging network is flooded by calls that the pagers can't recognize, robocalls. So what was happening is this paging network was getting overloaded by Abramovich's robocalls. The pagers were not interested in hearing about timeshare opportunities in Mexico. None of the doctors wanted to receive those robocalls on their pagers. So it had the effect of being a denial of service attack, an inadvertent denial of service attack, because Abramovich was just simply flooding communities with these abusive telemarketing calls, hawking cheap vacations. He was pretending to be from major American companies like Marriott and Expedia, TripAdvisor. He was affiliated with none of those companies at all. And we ended up finding him $120 million for those spoofing violations. But that investigation had two parts to it that I think are important and that I offer as a potential thought for how to approach solving the robocalling problem for this group. The two parts were, first, there was a sort of a triage period. The immediate goal when we heard about what was happening with the paging network the immediate goal was to get the calls stopped because they were putting lives at risk. Doctors were not receiving pages in a timely manner. That affects quality of health care. That was intolerable. So our first step that we took, within hours and in the following days after Abramovich's activities came to light was figuring out where the calls were coming from and then stopping them, cutting off that traffic at the source. After we had successfully done that, and that process only took a few days, but the longer term process that started in 2016, and we eventually fined him in 2017. So it took more than a year to put together. Was the case against him, the actual enforcement matter against him. So there was a two-part process, and one, when a hospital is experiencing these problems, the first priority is get the call stopped, and after that, it should be working with law enforcement, either at the state or federal level, to figure out who is responsible for that, and then effect enforcement afterwards. So in this case, we ended up fining him $120 million for those violations. It was at the time the largest fine in FCC history. We found that he intended to defraud consumers and cause harm. Like I said, he was pretending to be from blue chip American companies that he had no affiliation with. And there have been other cases that have arisen that have had that same negative effect on hospital networks. Not too long after our case against Abramovich, we investigated and pursued a case against Philip Rosell, who was doing robocalls selling health insurance plans, also disrupted the same critical paging network there for hospitals. And again, we used the same two-part approach. First, to triage and stop the calls from coming in, and then after that, take enforcement action against the violator. That's all. That's my thoughts on enforcement. Happy to take any questions that anyone may have, and thank you again for the opportunity being here.
Thank you, Christy. I see a question from Aaron. Go ahead, please, Aaron.
Hey, Christy. Great presentation. Really, I always like seeing your expertise in this. Can you, to the level that you can, obviously, can you tell us a little bit about how the robocallers see themselves or how they think of themselves? Right? I don't think anybody thinks that they're really kind of doing harm, especially to the hospital side, but you're probably the closest person on this call that has talked to these robocallers and things. It might give us on the committee a little bit of help to kind of put ourselves in their shoes and think like them.
That's a great question. So yeah, not surprisingly, it's really a range. There are robocallers out there that are just purely malicious. They know that what they're doing is illegal. They know that they are engaging in fraud. They do that deliberately. And if you call them out on it, they don't care. These are kind of hardened, criminal mindset people. The best example of which are the Indian call centers, call centers that operate out of India that are doing government imposter scams. They're pretending to be the Social Security Administration. They're pretending to be the IRS. The attitudes of those folks are very much, well, who cares? We're ripping off rich Americans. They don't care about the harm that they do to American networks. They don't care about potential loss of life. They are unmoved by these kind of, they're unmoved by moral concerns. They're there to make money at someone else's expense. That's the whole point. And there's no point trying to negotiate with them because they feel like they're entitled to other people's money. Then there are Abramovich was interesting. I did meet he did meet with us in person, and I got to talk to him, and he was full of all kinds of excuses in his Senate testimony, and then in person about how the real problem here is that there just isn't a legal way to make all of these illegal telemarketing calls and to call people who are on the do not call list. And that was sort of like a facepalm moment because it's like, yes, that's the point. That's why the laws are there, because consumers don't want your calls. They're trying to opt out of them. You're upset that you're now in legal trouble, trouble with the law for having made all of them. That doesn't mean that that's a problem. That means that you need to stop doing what you're doing. Then there's folks like Phil Rosell, who remarked to one of his employees that, and he was also responsible for making calls that disrupted hospital paging networks. He remarked to one of his employees at one point, says, "Yeah, these robocalls are illegal, but they're like speeding ticket illegal. They're not really illegal." Well, his speeding ticket ended up being $82 million from the FCC. So there is, in some cases, there is ignorance. It's small time operators just getting their feet wet into the telemarketing world who do not realize as they're getting into it that telemarketing is a highly, highly regulated and closely scrutinized industry. And then there are people who are like John Spiller, who the state AG offices recently sued in Texas federal court, and who the FCC also issued a major case against, who are doing it who know that what they're doing is likely skirting the law, but they're making money and they don't care. And then there are those who are just outright criminals who really don't care and will not listen to reason.
Thanks, Christy. We have another question from John Brayo. Go ahead, John, please.
Christy, hi. This is John Brayo from the National Consumers League. Thank you for your presentation. I did have a couple of questions specific to the hospital context. Your presentation described sort of a unique vulnerability that hospitals have to robocalls as their reliance on pagers. What I didn't hear, and I apologize if I just missed this, is whether there are other sort of unique vulnerabilities among hospitals to robocallers. Just in my own research, getting ready for this working group, I had heard of sort of extension numbers being in sequential order and being uniquely vulnerable to the use of auto dialers. So that's sort of, if you could sort of just let us know if there are any other unique vulnerabilities that the hospitals experience, that would be useful. And then sort of the second part of my question was, I was interested in the slide you put up where you showed sort of all of the multiple hops that a robocaller could take to reach their intended target. Are there sort of additional, yes, that slide. Are there incremental costs to sort of Vinnie Villain for adding additional hops into that? And is that relevant? I'm just wondering if the cost is so low that for Vinnie Villain, the cost of putting practically infinite number of hops in to try and make traceback harder is significant or not.
Gotcha. Yeah. So let's see, on your first question having to do with unique harms to hospitals. Any large, so you're right, you're talking about sequential numbers, and that, you know, any large organization that has a lot of phone lines, that's typically what you do. You know, negotiate with your telephone service provider. Let's say I'm a large organization. I have 500 employees. I need 500 different telephone lines. Great, the phone company will sell you a block of telephone numbers that all have the same same 6 digits, you know, area code and exchange code, and then, you know, your different employees just have the last 4 digits. This is very common. It's not unique to hospitals, but because, you know, any large organization, including government agencies, for that matter, will run on that sort of extension model. But it is something that because you're right, because robocallers do, the malicious and harmful ones especially, tend to flood entire area codes or entire exchange codes with no, you know, they have no, they're brute force attacking basically. Every number in that block of 10,000 numbers that has the same area code and exchange code, the first 6 digits of your 10-digit phone number. They'll dial every single number, and they're just hoping to get, you know, one person who will answer, because that's their opportunity to try and scam someone. So it's not unique to hospitals, but it does affect them. I'm very interested in hearing from hospitals in particular. You can go back to that HOP slide again, and I'll talk to you. Go back to that. Yeah, I'm very interested in talking to hospital folks on this call and elsewhere, and integrating to find out more about how, you know, particular harms that they face that are different, that we may not know about. I don't have any other particular ones that I'm aware of, but I'm very much hoping that these conversations will, you know, produce that to the extent that they exist. Your second question, which is, which I think boils down to, does Vinnie Villain have to pay any extra to have his call go through all of those hops? The answer is no. In fact, Vinnie Villain very likely doesn't even know that when he makes that call that it's going to go through, you know, up to, as we see in this example, up to 4 different carriers before it finally reaches its destination. That's because his provider, Omega VoIP, doesn't know that it's going to go through that many. It all depends on the interconnection agreements with each one of those individual providers. Those individual providers decide who they're going to connect with and how much traffic they're going to take. In order to, not every provider can handle all the traffic. Some specialize in outbound calls only, some specialize in inbound, some want to service end users. Those are, you know, your large telephone companies, AT&T and Verizon, CenturyLink of the world. Some don't. Some want to be just a middleman and not have any end user customers at all. So it really depends on how those individual companies have decided how to interconnect with each other, and they make those decisions independently. So no, he doesn't have to pay anything to make it go through different hops. In fact, he has no control over that, by and large. What bad guys are doing now is trying to route their traffic at the first instance through foreign providers. So they may be a VoIP, but they try and pick an overseas VoIP, hoping that will slow down, you know, the American traceback efforts and slow down American enforcement, because the calls appear to be originating from overseas. But in terms of like the cost, no, he just pays for he pays to make his calls on a flat rate basis, and it's fractions of a penny per call, which is why it's so profitable to be a robocaller right now.
Great, thank you.
Okay, I love how Vinnie Villain's costume is both villainous and socially responsible. He's looks like he's in a COVID-19 mask there.
Yeah.
We have another question from John Regi.
Hi, Christy. Thanks for your presentation. Really interesting. Looking at the enforcement side here a little bit, I'm figuring out how much of a deterrent it is for these guys. Were you able to collect any portion of the 120 million? And second part of that is, if these guys are located overseas, are you getting cooperation from foreign governments in these cases?
Those are great questions. Yes, those are great questions. So your first question on Mr. Abramovich, have we collected anything? This was an FCC action, and Congress does not allow us to collect any of our own money. So just from a process perspective, what we have to do is forward our case on to the Department of Justice and say, DOJ, hey, you're our lawyers. Would you please collect this money? This is a bad guy who did bad things. We fined him $120 million. Would you please collect on behalf of the American people? Also, in addition to not being able to collect our own money, we also don't get to keep any of our own money. So when I say that, we find this is on behalf of the American people, that's literally true. Whatever money DOJ gets out of Adrian Abramovich goes directly into the United States Treasury. So it goes into the big pot. As of now, DOJ is still in litigation with Abramovich, so it's not yet settled. Those kind of cases can take a very long time. Obviously, this is a high stakes issue with a lot of money on the table. I am also eagerly awaiting to find out what the final verdict will be with DOJ on that one. Your second question, sorry, remind me, what was your second question again?
For these guys, subjects that are located overseas.
Oh, overseas, yes.
Yeah.
Yes, right, sorry. Do we get cooperation from overseas governments? It depends. The answer is that it depends on the government and where they are coming from. Many of the I'm sorry for everyone who's heard me say this exact thing before, but for many of the problematic campaigns that we see come from Pakistan. And I am reminded that this is a country that would not hand over Osama bin Laden. The chances of them handing over some random telemarketing, robocalling villain are infinitesimal. If the United States has a difficult diplomatic relationship with a country where the calls are coming from, it's going to be impossible to get them to cough up money. We also see or cough up the violator. We also see a lot of calls originating out of the People's Republic of China, Hong Kong. That's another one that's difficult. The call centers coming out of India is tricky. India, the government officials want to be helpful. They have sporadically taken action, but their process is so cumbersome that I have to say I'm personally a little disappointed with their cooperation. Not perhaps for lack of interest, but for lack of follow through. Conversely, we have outstanding relationships with our counterparts in Canada, the United Kingdom, Australia, New Zealand, Denmark. There's an international consortium of fraud investigators that meets annually and keeps in touch and shares information. So we do have allies. One interesting thing about robocalls that you may not know, but that for the last many years, illegal robocalling has only been a problem in English-speaking countries. This is not a problem that you typically see in countries where Spanish or French is the predominant language, although that is starting to change just a little bit. So there are a lot of countries that, if you try and talk about this problem, at a security conference, they just have no experience with this at all, just because it's basically an unknown issue over there. I find that very, very interesting, and I don't necessarily know why English-speaking countries are such a target, but there it is.
Christy, thanks so much.
Christy, it's Patrick from U.S. Telecom. Do you mind if I add one bit to that?
Oh, please.
So just, John, to your question, when we do tracebacks, and it's exactly as Christy talked about, we will start from the terminating carrier of the customer that actually received the call, and we'll coordinate through a process that we have. going as far back up through the chain as we can to identify the originating provider and even the actual party itself that went to that provider to make the calls. And then when we have evidence of illegal activity, we'll coordinate with the Enforcement Bureau, as well as the FTC, the states, some of which are on this call right now that are familiar with the process. And we sort of look at how do we best solve this problem. And, you know, in a perfect world, we would just literally identify all of the major hubs of illegal calling activity internationally, including some of the countries that Christy just mentioned, go straight to those call centers, straight to those calling parties, and just shut them down and put them out of business. And then we'd be good, right? We wouldn't be having this working group call today. But that's easier said than done for some of the reasons Christy identified. So that said, as we're doing this, we're looking at tracing back the calls as far back as we can up to the source. And for many of the fraud calls, including some of the ones that Dave talked about earlier that maybe are targeting hospital employees, unfortunately, a lot of that stuff tends to be originating overseas, not exclusively, but a lot of it. And we will trace it back and try to identify, well, where is the traffic coming into the U.S.? That's sometimes what the agencies will refer to as the gateway provider. We sometimes refer to it as the U.S. point of entry. And we will then provide information to that point of entry onto the U.S. network to say, hey, we want to make sure you understand that this traffic appears to be illegal traffic, including fraudulent traffic. And please take whatever steps you can to cut off relationships with whoever is sending you this traffic. And we're seeing some success there. That's one way to do it, right? It's just, we know it's going to keep getting originated, so let's try to figure out where it's coming onto the U.S. network and then cut it off as well as we can. The challenge there, of course, is there's lots of different entities who are capable of taking that traffic internationally and then finding a way to put it onto the U.S. network. It's a little bit of a game of whack-a-mole, but it's something that we have to do. I will say, though, that even when we find the point of entry, we keep tracing it back. We keep tracing it back as far as we can, sometimes even identifying the actual entity or individual, you know, who was the one who put the illegal calls onto the network in those foreign countries. And then at that point, you know, candidly, it's outside of industry's hands, obviously, as to what happens with that information, but we try to get as much as we can and coordinate with the enforcement agencies as best we can, as I think Christy has quite effectively described.
Got it. Very helpful. Thank you.
All right. I don't believe there are any more questions. I'm just going to do another quick run through. Everyone who's raised your hand previously, please lower your hand. All right. So, Christy, I don't see any more questions. So I just want to thank you so much. That was a great presentation, obviously, stirred up a lot of interest. We had quite a few questions on that one. Thank you to all of our presenters today. You all did a fantastic job. I was asked privately if we're going to make the slides for the presentations available to everyone, and the answer to that is yes. So we will work on getting those out to you all sometime this week. As I mentioned when Christy came on to speak, she is an alternate for Commissioner Carr. So I thought this was a good time to bring that up. Just very quickly say that you are allowed to submit to me, you can send it to me directly, the name of any alternate that you would like to sit in for you during any of these meetings, working group meetings, et cetera. So if we hadn't had the opportunity to discuss that with you before, I know I've done it with a few people, but I don't know if everyone got the message. So please feel free to submit the name of an alternate. That person is going to be vetted by our general counsel's office, just like you were. And we'll try to do it quickly so that, you know, either you or your alternate can sit in on any upcoming meeting. Okay, so next we have on the agenda questions from the public. So I'm going to ask my colleague, Greg Cook, do we have any questions from the public that we need to address? Greg, are you there?
I am. It's the old muting problem.
Mute the phone,
You know,
yes.
I checked to see if I haven't been forwarded any. I don't see any. I don't see any yet, and I did email Barbara Britt to see if she had received any, and I haven't heard anything. So I think no. But for the questions from the public, we would be, taking those and forwarding them to the appropriate subject matter experts and getting back to the folks, so they will not have been asked in vain if they don't get mentioned now.
Okay. Thank you, Greg. Next on the agenda is a discussion of next meetings and logistics. It is expected that the working groups will meet weekly to perform work on their assigned tasks. We are going to work with you starting tomorrow, as soon as tomorrow, to help you coordinate your first meetings. And I'm going to reach out to the group chair and vice chair, and also to the chairs of the three working groups, to try to get that coordination going so that we can get up and running. Our time frame is short, so we'd like to very quickly move on to scheduling those meetings. Do we have any questions about that? You may have, some concerns as to how this is all going to work. So we'll try to hammer out some of those in the coming week and try to answer any questions that you may have. And the chairs of the working groups and the chair and vice chair of the group will reach out to you as well to let you keep you abreast of everything that's going on. So I'm looking through to see if there are any questions, and I'm not seeing none. And I'm checking my email and my text messages to see if anyone's trying to reach me before we close. So I don't see any. I'm just going to do one more pass through of the hand raising. Okay. So seeing no questions, this concludes the first meeting of the Hospital Robocall Protection Group. Thank you all for your participation. This has been a wonderful meeting, and we look forward to working closely with each of you. Thank you again, everyone, and have a great rest of your day. We are going to be reaching out to you this week to let you know next steps. Thanks, everyone. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.